Well, here we are, and we're talking to Justice Linda Neuman on September 28th, 2016, and we're at the U.S. Courthouse in Davenport, Iowa. And Linda and I have been friends a long time, since I started practice in 1977 when I was new here, and at that time there were maybe 5 women lawyers, 6. And we'd have lunch at the Standard Hotel, which is no longer here, and the 6 of us could fit around one booth. And so here we are, almost 40 years later, still sitting around one little table, talking about what it is we're doing. So what are you doing today, or these days?
Oh, well, gosh, that kind of skipped over 40 years. I
know. See, that was the trick question. Well, we could start slower and ask you your age. We could do that.
Really?
Okay.
I'm 68, and to be honest, last week I did a settlement mediation on which took me all day Friday. Saturday, I do pro bono work for the Episcopal Diocese of Iowa. I happen to be the co-chancellor. Volunteer work. That meant I had to drive all the way to Des Moines on Saturday, spend my day, about 12 hours on the road, and at a board of directors meeting for the Episcopal Corporation in Des Moines. That was after spending 12 hours working and on the road Friday. It makes me wonder whether I'm really retired.
Well, I don't think you are, and I think you just switched gears ever so slightly, because when I was looking at the timeline, and it said that you retired in 2003, I thought, no, you didn't. That just can't even be right.
I loved it when Judge Pratt introduced me at some gathering, and he said something to the effect, the words retired and Linda Neuman should not be used in the same sentence. But as you know, my husband and I were in a bad collision, motor vehicle collision in the last year.
A horrible, horrific one.
It was, and to be helicoptered to Iowa City and to end up with a couple casts, and my husband and I were both had 4 broken legs between the two of us and other injuries, and in wheelchairs for a couple months and living at a nursing home. It does give you a different perspective on your life and what's important. And it's only recently that I feel like I'm being drawn back into some of the work that I'd done in the past, and I wasn't entirely sure recently that I was getting much joy out of that. So I'm thinking real hard about what the next phase is, but right now I'm happy to be a semi-retired lawyer and fully retired judge, and have been since 2003.
Well, I remember when you were thinking about retiring, because of course you were so young, and thought, well, maybe you should just work another 10 years like a normal person. And, and Henry's saying, well, you should, work to live and not live to work.
Henry has been a great mentor over the years about that. He's probably the happiest lawyer I know in terms of carving out time at the beginning of the year for things he wants to do, mostly travel and related, and sports sort of related. But then he works real hard in between, and he loves his work and loves his clients. And at this point, probably the decision whether we both sort of retire turns a lot on when he's ready to hang it up at the law firm. But meanwhile, we're having a good time together and enjoying life. But now, we have children and grandchildren who are further away from Iowa, and so that also gives us pause, and it requires us to take more time to see them and spend time with them, and that's a great joy to us. So, but life is good overall.
Well, and Henry's back on the motorcycle. I'm obliged to say that this was a motorcycle accident with a deer, and here he is back on a motorcycle.
Well, that's Henry. But I often say the reason I'm in Iowa, the reason this all got started was because in law school at the University of Colorado, I fell in love with an Iowan. And I would never have guessed that 43 years later, we'd still be here. I always kind of thought we'd go back to Colorado, where I grew up, to practice law. But Iowa has been really good to us. And one of the other things that we realized, that we should have known before, but we realized and felt very deeply after this accident, was what a network of friends we've developed in the Quad Cities over the years. And the lawyers who came to visit us, and the judges, and the cards, and the cookies, and just the meals, and the looking after us, was just phenomenal, actually. So that really makes you think about where your future lies in terms of the real retirement, if there is such a thing.
Well, you're only admitted in Iowa, right?
That's true.
So you can't go to Colorado.
No, certainly not to practice law. I would be doing entirely different things if I were there. Interestingly, Celeste, a friend of ours who joined us in Colorado at our family home there for a couple weeks, mentioned that and this was something I hadn't really thought about, she said, Linda, if you moved to Estes Park, Colorado, you would, she didn't say you'd be a nobody, but it was something like that. Like, you have a certain reputation to maintain so long as you live in Iowa. And it's true. And my immediate response was, that's not a problem for me. I'd be glad to volunteer at the library, or, there are lots of other good works that could be done to make our days purposeful, besides hiking and bicycling and things like that, which is what we love to do when we're there, and watch movies.
Well, and I mean, it was the fact that both you and Henry are in really excellent physical shape that helped you survive getting run over by a deer. I mean, considering every broken part that both of you had, and your concussion, and the little tiny brain bleed, and all the surgery that you had, to have both of you really have recovered with amazing amount of mobility.
Yeah, you're absolutely. We are really blessed. We had excellent medical care, and we were lucky to be in as good a shape as we were in for 68-year-olds when the accident happened. So we're grateful for that.
But that's really kind of part of the path. I mean, you grew up in Colorado, you have a place there, and so you've always hiked and been connected to nature. And how is it that Henry, the guy from Davenport, whose family was from the Quad Cities, ended up in Colorado?
Well, his parents were great travelers. I mean, really world travelers, but they always loved Colorado. And his parents were married in like 1930 or 1933, after Henry's dad graduated from the University of Iowa Law School. And I think they went to Yellowstone for their honeymoon, and I'm not sure the roads were all paved from Iowa to Wyoming in 1933. In fact, I'm quite certain they weren't, and they had one of those, I mean, it was an old car. They had to take several spare tires, put the clothes in a box. Henry's mother, who was always dressed to the nines whenever I knew her, had to buy, she bought jodhpurs and a plaid flannel shirt so they could, because they camped out, right, on their honeymoon. So anyway, then from there they kind of migrated. After that, they started going to Estes Park, and they had trailers. And so for years and years, the family trooped out to Rocky Mountain National Park in the summertime, and eventually in the mid-60s, they built a home there. And Henry and I were actually married in that house in 1973. And so anyway, he'd had this history of going to Colorado as a boy and hiking and climbing. He really was a pretty experienced mountain climber, rock climber, not just a hiker. And, well, this is about me, not about Henry.
It is about you. I was waiting for you to get back to law school, so that's where you met.
Yeah, so we met in law school. And the only funny thing one of the funny things I think about that is we were in the same class in law school, and at that time, that would have been 1970 to 1973, we always were arrayed in alphabetical order in class. So, as it turns out, our closest friends from law school are all in the JKLMNOP sort of list. My maiden name was Kinney, so I was a K. Henry was a Neuman. Our other good friends are Jim Keene, Linda Mounts, Bill O'Dell, Stan Peake, Wes Light. They were all in that
same row.
In the same row. And we've continued to be friends over the years. Wes Light, who was at the top of our class at the University of Colorado Law School, he was the mayor of Crested Butte, Colorado at one time. We just he was recently a guest at our house. And anyway, I think that's sort of funny. But that's kind of how Henry and I got thrown in together at the University of Colorado.
Your name didn't begin with a B.
Exactly, I never would have known him.
How many people were in your law school class? Do you remember?
It was large for the time. I think, as I recall, the class started out about 190, which was quite large for the University of Colorado.
And how many women?
Well, I think there were 10 actually who graduated from the class. There might have been a few more to start.
So your dad was a lawyer, and were there other lawyers in your family?
Yes, my dad's sister-in-law, Helen Kinney, really was, I wouldn't call her a mentor, but she was always somebody who was out there, who I knew had been a lawyer. I mean, even as a child, I knew she was an accomplished lawyer, and then she went on to be a judge, a circuit court judge in Illinois, at a time when there were virtually no women circuit court judges, at that time. That would have been well before I went to law school. She was an amazing woman. She was the mother of my three favorite cousins, Susie, Marcia, and Linny. And we used to spend a fair amount of time. My family, of course, lived in Denver, Colorado. We'd moved from Chicago. I should say my parents were both born and raised in Chicago. I was born in Chicago. But my dad took a position with the Colorado National Bank with their trust department in 1956, and so we all moved to Colorado then. But we would always the summer trip was always across Nebraska to visit my grandmother and grandfather, who still lived in Illinois. And during that time, my Aunt Helen, after the girls were born, she decided, for whatever reason, to go back to law school, and she graduated first in her class at DePaul, excuse me, and then went on to have a position with the state's attorney's office, and was featured in the Chicago Tribune, I remember at one time, as really being the lead prosecutor in a trucking industry scandal, probably in the late 60s, I would guess, sometime. And anyway, ultimately, and then she was a delegate to the Illinois Constitutional Convention around sometime in that time frame, late 60s, early 70s, sometime.
Like around the ERA.
Yes, it was before that, okay. I think. But then ultimately she ran for circuit court judge, which they do in Illinois. Now, my Aunt Helen was, she was just brilliant. She just was, but very sweet and very kind. But my family, of course, always thought, what is it with this woman? She's married to a successful businessman. She's got 3 kids. What is she doing going to law school? She's never, I think the complaint that I was hearing was that she hardly cooks a meal, they have to have somebody else watching the kids, things like that. And I'm just sort of absorbing this as a young woman, So it was pretty cool, ultimately, when I went to law school and made a partner in a law firm, ended up on, ultimately, trial court judge and then Supreme Court judge, because in 1986, when I was sworn into the Iowa Supreme Court, my Aunt Helen, and Uncle Les and everybody, of course, were at the ceremony. And so I told them this favorite Kinney family story that I'd heard over the years. And that was that even though my grandfather, Harold Kinney, I heard a lot of criticism sort of my aunt in terms of her homemaking skills. He was really very proud of her as a lawyer. So as the family story went, one day, and he was kind of a gruff sort of guy, but he was in an argument with a man over the terms of a contract, and we'll call the other guy Mr. Smith. And finally, Mr. Smith got exasperated and said, "Mr. Kinney, I'm a lawyer. I know I'm right. Or I know I'm right. I'm a lawyer." And my grandfather replied, "Mr. Smith, in my family, that's women's work." So that was kind of the background I had, and I told that story with everybody present and a lot of people in the Supreme Court chambers, and got a nice laugh. But what I was quoted about afterwards was the idea that the law is neither women's work nor men's work, but really a solemn responsibility that we all have to uphold the Constitution, uphold the law, provide the respect and dignity of everybody that comes before us every day in our work. So anyway, that was my Aunt Helen. So she was always sort of out there and a little mysterious, but I have, over the years, I've really learned to appreciate what a sort of pioneer she really was, you know, so.
Well, when you decided to go to law school, was your dad in favor of that, or did your parents say, what are you going to do with that degree?
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's sort of interesting because I was the oldest child. I have two siblings, my brother Steve, who was 2 years younger than me, and a sister, Nancy, who was 6 years younger than me. Both very bright and accomplished people, obviously, in their own right, just great siblings. But I think it would be fair to say I was the oldest and kind of the oldest daughter, you know, and kind of apple of my dad's eye. But when I mentioned that I was thinking about law school, his first reaction was he thought it was a great idea because it would be easier for me to get a job because they wouldn't have to pay me as much because I was a woman. And you know, not having yet gone to law school, I hadn't really thought that through. You know, I thought, really? Of course, subsequently, when I took a course in law school and women in the law, I realized how outrageous that really was, but I wasn't.
But not untrue.
Not untrue, and really obviously sort of accepted even by people who loved you, you know. So, no, he thought it was a great idea. He continued to be super proud of me. I mean, a real fan of mine all the way through both the practice and as a judge. But that sort of brings to mind one time when he was visiting us. He and my mom, I guess, were visiting. And I was a trial judge at that time on the district court bench, and I was going to be doing a sentencing in Muscatine. I just presided over, I think, a first-degree robbery trial, and it was set for sentencing. So I asked my dad if he wanted to join me. And it turned out to be a really emotional experience for him because there I was, here was the defendant and his family, and he was going to be sentenced to, as I recall, you know, like 25 years or something, you know. And here's my dad observing his daughter up on the bench. It was real emotional for him. But what was funny was afterwards when we talked about that, and he expressed that idea, and how on the one hand he was really proud of me, and it was quite emotional for him. He had sat in on an earlier proceeding where another one of the judges, a man judge, Judge Burns actually, was holding some kind of hearing. And my dad just couldn't help but say, he kind of liked the way, though, that Judge Burns presided over his case. It was kind of like, Dad, really? Give me a break. You know, you're never, he was always, he just always pushed me, I'd say, as a child. I'd write a paper, and he'd say, really, Linda, can't you write a better paper than that? You know, it was that sort of thing. On the one hand, proud and encouraging. On the other hand, couldn't you do it a little bit better? So that was my dad. My mom, I think, always thought, she did not go to college. She was a stay-at-home mom. And I think, growing up, she just always thought I should have some useful profession like a beautician. You know, she worked in a beauty shop for a short time. And so we were never quite on the same wavelengths as far as that goes.
When I went to law school, my Aunt Ruth said, well, that's just really good because you'll always have something to fall back on.
Yes.
And I'm like, well, no, I'm going to work, Aunt Ruth.
Yeah.
That was like a new idea that, you know, we might get married and I would still work.
It was. So. And then, of course, I've told the story many times, but I might as well get it on this oral history. Yeah, on this tape, that when Henry and I were contemplating our future, we were actually married our third year in law school.
Why did you get married in law school?
Well, that's a great question. The only woman professor in the law school had that same question. In fact, she refused to come to a bridal shower that my friends had for me because she just thought it was so outrageous that I was getting married. The reason we kind of moved up the wedding date was that Henry had a house in Boulder, and he was able to sell it before we got married, and so then we wanted to get married and move to the house in Estes Park to finish up law school. So that was the whole reason.
Very pragmatic.
Exactly. But what I was going to say, but at some point near the end of law school, we were trying to decide our future, and Henry decided he really wanted to come back and practice with his dad. His dad was the senior partner of the Betty Neuman law firm in Davenport. It used to be Betty Neuman, McMahon, Hellstrom, and Bittner. And he thought it'd be nice to practice with his dad for a few years. So I distinctly remember one Sunday afternoon, he called his dad to kind of ask him about that and wondered if there would be a place in the law firm for me. And Henry Sr., without missing a beat, said, she would make a great legal secretary. Well, when Henry told me that, I was like, oh gosh, that doesn't sound like a very good idea. Well, Henry's dad was he was a real serious sort of guy.
Oh, very.
Yeah, anybody who ever knew him, he was a really kind-hearted, but very serious. You know, as I say, he never watched television. He only read books, and he only read great books. You know, and and he only talked about serious subjects. At one point that spring, we were visiting Henry's folks, and at breakfast one morning, he decided he wanted to engage. He tried to engage Henry in a tax question, an income tax question. And Henry didn't have any idea what he was talking about. And I had just taken the tax exam. So I just sort of jumped into the conversation, you know, and you could see this light bulb go on in Henry Sr.'s head, like, this woman is a lawyer. She's going to be a lawyer, you know. And that was kind of a turning point for us. So anyway, I ended up, after law school and taking the bar, passing the bar, we both ended up at the law firm. There was work for both of us to do, and Henry Sr. turned out to be a wonderful mentor. But part of the way I realize now in retrospect a person's reputation is made is that everybody knew that Henry Sr. was really opposed to women practicing law. I mean, he just was very bold about it, you know. So suddenly here I am on the scene, and he's introducing me to lawyers and judges and so forth. And I learned later they're thinking, well, if Henry Sr. thinks she's okay, she must really be something. And I wasn't really something, but I had married into this nice family, and they accepted me and ended up ultimately being made a partner in the law firm.
Well, I two things there. It wasn't like, oh, I just happened to be around and they tolerated me. I mean, you had your good reputation for good work on your own. But I also think the Scott County Bar is a pretty special place. I mean,
absolutely.
I just think it's a very supportive and easily mentoring, so that I worked in the firm upstairs with John Carlin, but we came down and used your library because we didn't have books, and you did. And so even though we were usually the plaintiffs and somebody from Betty Neuman was the defendant, we were there. Yeah. But it was that kind of collegial bar, and the same thing with reaching out to legal aid. If Mike or Mary Ellen called, well, of course you would take it just wouldn't occur to you to say no.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Whereas not every community has that kind of seamless relationship.
I think you're absolutely right. And what was I going to say? I know. When I came back to practice law here, Margaret Briles was corporation counsel. Kathy Kirschbaum was the mayor. To a young woman professional, that really spelled promise for this community. And although there really hadn't, aside from, there was Betty
Shaw.
Betty Shaw.
And Frances
Plath and Margaret Briles. Right. And they were kind of the three women lawyers here. And there was about 20 years between each of our ages. So I was kind of the newer generation.
The new kids,
yeah. But I was really, accepted at the law firm and welcomed there and given good work to do, pretty quickly on. And so that was a great opportunity for me. I had a chance to work with some really good lawyers at the Betty Law Firm. And they were fun, and you're right, it was very collegial. And I think it's continued to be that way. The judges, the lawyers just sort of accept you for who you are.
Well, I think as long as you do good work.
Yeah.
I mean, they really do judge you on the merit of your ability either in the courtroom or to deliver whatever it is you said you would do.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing with opportunities in the Bar Association. If you want to work, hey, we've got jobs,
Sure.
Which is not, it's not as political or, who knows who kind of a thing. I mean, that might open a door, but it's not going to keep a door open.
No. One of the stories I remember, because your mentor and partner John Carlin, of course, was an important person in this bar association.
And gruff.
But very well respected. But what's interesting is the way, I've thought a lot lately about the difference between mentors and sponsors. Clay Legrand was a person very much admired in this legal community, and who of course then spent many years on the Iowa Supreme Court. But John Carlin was another one who I can remember having cases against John and working with him and so forth. But it never occurred to me that sort of behind the scenes, he was in fact maybe mentioning to the powers that be that, she knows what she's doing. She's a good lawyer. And what was, I'll never forget, was such a surprise to me, the day I got the call from the governor's office that that the governor was going to appoint me the first woman on the Iowa Supreme Court. They said, now, don't tell anybody. And I get this at my call at the courthouse. And so I'm a rule follower, so, right. I don't tell a soul. And I walk out of my door and here's a reporter and I just pretend like I don't know anything. And the governor's going to have a press conference at the Quad City Airport. And of course I have told Henry, I think they said you can call your husband, So I called Henry and I'm going to meet him at the airport. I get out to the airport out at Mount Joy, and in the parking lot I happen to see John Carlin standing on the sidewalk, and my first thought is, what's John Carlin doing here? Well, of course, he was someone who had written a letter on my behalf, unbeknownst to me, or talked to the governor about me. And, in retrospect, I think, how amazing is that? How wonderful that people that you didn't even ask would simply, stand up and sponsor you before a body like the nominating commission or the governor. It seems so odd to me that I even question what was John Carlin doing standing on the sidewalk at the airport.
Well, it wouldn't have occurred to me. I would have thought, oh, there must be a plaintiff case here,
Right. Yeah, it turned out that at the investiture ceremony at the state capitol, and subsequently the governor read a letter from John Carlin. So anyway, turns out he was among the people who were stirring things up on my behalf.
Again, I wouldn't have guessed that. If you would have asked me what were the puzzle pieces falling in place, I wouldn't have called John, and I worked with him. Yeah. So,
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I was really fortunate over the years to come in contact with men and women who, for whatever reason, seemed to appreciate my work and who I was and the promise that I had. I often think it had nothing to do with, obviously it had something to do with me, but it wasn't like I was actively seeking those mentorships or sponsorships. It just sort of happened. Clay Legrand is another good example. He was just so beloved in the Bar Association, and we mostly got acquainted with him, though, because his law clerk, Michael Hobart, and his wife, Mary Ellen, showed up in Iowa to practice law about the same time Henry and I got here from Colorado. And I kid you not, I was walking down the street one day. Let me back up. Boulder, Colorado is a different place than Davenport, Iowa, right? It just is. There were some cultural differences there. So I'm walking down the street and I see this nice young woman passes me, and she's got her hair in braids and kind of a
long skirt.
Yeah, kind of a different kind of outfit, And I thought, she is not from Davenport, Iowa. I subsequently learned that she was a lawyer, had gone to Catholic University. Her husband, Michael, had been hired by Clay Legrand as his law clerk for that year. And ultimately, we grew to be very close friends. And we both happened to be pregnant with our children at the same time as lawyers, she working for Legal Aid, my working for the Betty Neuman law firm. And so, our children kind of grew up together, and I was the godmother of their first son, Josh. And anyway, great friends. But through them, I got to know Justice Legrand a little better. And of course, he had his office at the Scott County Courthouse, and so we would see him pretty regularly there. And anyway, I was going to say the sort of joke on the Supreme Court when I got there was that early in my career, there was an opening on the Continuing Legal Education Commission, the CLE Commission.
Right.
And Iowa, of course, was one of the first states in the United States to have mandatory continuing legal education. And they were putting together a group of esteemed lawyers around the state to work on that project. And Clay evidently had recommended me. Well, I don't think anybody on the court ever heard of me, and I'd only been a lawyer for a couple of years. I mean, maybe 4 or 5, not very long. Anyway, I remember he called and asked if I would consider that, and I didn't even have a concept of what that involved, but I started going to Des Moines for these meetings, and anyway, it was a great opportunity for me to meet some really good lawyers from around the state who were working on that project. The chair of the committee was Art McGivern, who subsequently became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I'll tell you a story about that, but when I ultimately got on the Iowa Supreme Court, they used to joke about when they had the vote about who was going to be on the CLE Commission. I got 10 votes, and they always accused Clay of voting for me twice.
Out of the 9 members.
Exactly, So anyway, there was obviously something going on there. But that was a real and important introductory experience for me to get out of Davenport and to be recognized, but to be somebody, a young woman. There just weren't women on Supreme Court commissions, I don't think, at that time to speak of. There weren't that many women in the state to choose from, and they weren't making it.
But you had people like Clay, or you had people like Ward Reynoldson, who would make sure that there were opportunities for women and would remind colleagues that you might want to spread this around a little bit and not just call on the same old. And that was, late 70s, early 80s was a time when there seemed to be a lot of promise and a lot of, Judge Briles has gotten appointed here, and Lynn Brady in Cedar Rapids, and at that time, there were women who were trying to make sure that there were always women applicants for every vacancy, so that the answer couldn't be, well, no one applied.
Right.
So when you applied to be a part-time magistrate judge here in this district, how did that, did you say, oh, I could do that? Or did you say this is going to be toward my path of district court?
Well, I'd been a partner at the Benny Neuman law firm. Meanwhile, we had our first child, and that really changed things at the time. For me, I just didn't feel like there was a model out there for how you're a partner in a nice law firm and you're a parent, a mother too. And so I was just kind of trying to juggle those things, and at the time I was doing mostly transactional work. That was the nature of my father-in-law's practice, and there was estate planning and some tax stuff, that sort of thing. And so I was approached by a local bank to come and head up their trust department, just a small trust department. And I thought at the time that would be something that maybe that would give me more regular hours. I wouldn't be writing briefs in the middle of the night, that sort of thing, as we're prone to do. And so I took that position, and it was okay, but I wasn't crazy about it, to be honest. But I did that, I think, for 2 years. But along about the end of that, at the 2-year mark or a little before then, there happened to be an opening for a part-time judicial magistrate. Now, that was not a position that anybody in my former law firm would have ever thought you'd take, that was way down in the
Well, and in Iowa, you didn't have to be a lawyer.
That's right. That's right.
So, it really was somebody who just either had some time or liked doing traffic, which
small claims and that sort of thing, mental health commitments. But all of a sudden I thought, well, maybe I should apply for that. I thought I was asked to do some teaching through the University of Iowa School of Social Work, and I thought, well, maybe for the time being, I was shortly around that same time or shortly thereafter pregnant with our second daughter, Lindsay. And I just thought, I'm going to apply for this job, and maybe I can kind of put some things together part-time for a while. And I wasn't that crazy about what I was doing at the bank, although it turned out that's been an interesting...
There's been a
platform. There. Yeah, there's been a theme there. But anyway, so I applied for the position, and sure enough, I got the job. And there'd not been a woman magistrate in Scott County. And I kind of liked it. I mean, it was sort of fun. You were doing small claims, doing a lot of traffic sort of stuff, you know, simple misdemeanors. Mental health commitments, which turned out to be pretty challenging and kind of interesting work. My undergraduate degree in college had been psychology, so I had sort of an interest in mental health issues, I would say. And, but anyway, I just took that, and I found out I really liked it. I quit my job at the bank. So there was a period of time there where I was really just working kind of part-time. And I thought, well, this is kind of fun. I mean, it was really kind of an interesting position. So anyway, so that's kind of how I stepped into that. It was really getting out of one job that I wasn't too crazy about, that I learned a lot, and it was good work, but kind of bridging till the next thing. And so then ultimately I went back to the Betty Law Firm full-time, but it was about that time that there was an opening on the district court bench. And so then, having been a magistrate for a couple of years, I thought, well, I could apply for this position.
Right.
And that turned out, that worked out ultimately. And again, interestingly, you know, Margaret was the first woman, Margaret Browse, the first woman district court judge of general jurisdiction in the state, and I turned out to be the second. Lynn Brady had been an associate district court judge and later was appointed to the district court bench there in Cedar Rapids. But you know, women were admitted to practice law in this state 150 years before that, and yet, or close to 150 years before that, and yet I was only the second woman to be a general jurisdiction judge in the state. So that was sort of an interesting time, but really without a lot of fanfare at all. And you know, they didn't even, now it's funny to think about, they didn't have any kind of like a reception for me or anything like they do now if there's a new judge. I just showed up one day and kind of got sworn in. There were some kind of close friends and a couple family members there, and I went to work. I mean, I took plea proceedings, you know, right after that. And, but I liked the work. It was good. And I did that for 4 years.
Well, I was on the commission when you interviewed. And
Were you?
I was.
Really?
On the district court one.
I didn't know that, or I'd forgotten that.
I was in the room, yeah.
Sorry,
But, you know, because I had applied and found out that the commissions were not properly constituted, this being Scott County, because they would just let the lawyers serve until they didn't want to serve anymore. They didn't elect them every 6 years. And so after I had gone through the commission, then we got elections, and then I got elected.
Okay.
And then after that is when they changed the statute, you know, to make the commission gender balanced, which, you know, I don't know why it can't be all women after having been all men for the first 100 years, but oh well.
Yeah.
But I remember that because people were still perplexed at how you would travel and how you would go to other court points with small children.
I had a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old at that time. And admittedly, I was young. I was only 34. It must have been you probably who said, Linda, apply for this job, you know,
Right.
because that has been your nature over the years, and to everybody's, you know, great help. But I remember being asked that question, how could you travel? I mean, the whole tenor of the interview, the first interview, because there were 2 opportunities, the first interview was all related to how can you do this and be a mother? And it was just so disappointing to me because I thought, I mean, I just didn't have any opportunity to answer any questions about my skill or background or a couple years as a judge or anything. It was all related to how could I be doing and traveling to 5 counties? That was kind of the focus. So I just didn't feel like I was treated very fairly, but I didn't want to, you know, you don't want to be sour grapes. So when the slate came out, I told Henry that night, obviously when I came home from the interview, I thought, gosh, you know, it was kind of crummy. I didn't really get to tell him about who I was or talk about my work as a lawyer or anything. That wasn't the nature of the question. So, but I didn't complain. Well, Henry, bless his heart, as they say, tells a friend of mine, Maggie Tinsman,
Oh, well.
who couldn't believe it. You know, Linda Neuman wasn't treated fairly. So she calls up her friend Bob Ray, the governor, and says, I don't think they're doing things fairly over there in Scott County. Now, I didn't talk to Maggie. You know, this is all going on.
Right.
And the next thing I know, Governor Ray has decided not to accept that slate of 3 nominees from the nominating commission. And Judge Haverkamp,
was unheard of.
yes, and Judge Haverkamp was furious. Now, whether there were, he said there was some reason not to accept one of the candidates, and I don't even know what that was, but eventually one person pulled out. And so they had a renomination process, and they did new interviews. And the second time around, I thought, I'm going to go and talk to those people who seemed to not understand clearly that I thought I was capable of doing this job. And they were great. And so I went into the second interview, and the questions were all about, they were professional kind of questions, they were about work, you know. And I distinctly remember leaving that interview thinking, well, at least I was treated fairly, win or lose. That wasn't even that important to me at the time. I thought I'd been treated fairly. One of the funny things about the interview, I think, is that, you know, I had been sort of just working part-time, so I was a little embarrassed about writing that out on my long application form. But in the meantime, during that time, I had served on a bunch of committees. I had chaired this committee. I was in the United Way, and the Library Foundation, and the Marriage and Family Counseling, and I chaired the Grievance Committee for the Bar Association. Kind of was doing a lot of volunteer stuff. So anyway, one of the non-lawyer members of the committee said, Mrs. Neuman, I've looked at your application, and it seems to me that if you got a full-time job, it'd be a vacation. How true is that? You know?
Very true.
Anyway, so then I got the call. Then I guess I met with Governor Ray after that time, and then he appointed me. I think Mike Libby was the other person at that point who was, the two of us went to Des Moines, and Governor Ray appointed me. So that was my start in the district court.
And then what did you do? What kind of cases were there? Because that's 7th Judicial District.
Right.
So that is a 5-county area. It's not just Scott County.
Right.
And so general trial, civil,
Yeah.
criminal.
Civil, criminal, anything over small claims, basically. A lot of domestic, a lot of family law sorts of work, appeals from administrative agencies. I probably tried as many criminal cases as anybody, largely because Henry, being a partner in the Betty Neuman law firm, if there was ever a really large or significant civil case that had multiple lawyers, I would have to recuse myself. So I probably didn't do as much civil trial work as many of my colleagues, but on the other hand, it's sort of interesting the way the Constitution meets the people, as they say, in the criminal court. And so, you know, lots of first-degree murder trials and that sort of thing.
Scott County, we have a lot of Class A felonies.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And so, so there's quite a lot of that. And then I was also, the counties were Muscatine, Cedar County, Tipton, Maquoketa, and Clinton. So, you know, there was a fair amount of travel. Most of the time I was headquartered in Davenport, but I had I was low person on the totem pole for a long time, so I had the Maquoketa assignment in January 4 years in a row, you know, so I was driving up there in the wintertime, but it was just it was a great job. I liked just the day-to-day contact with lawyers, people. When I was first appointed magistrate, the wise words that I got from Judge Lowell Phelps, he chaired the commission, and he called me on a Sunday afternoon to tell me that I'd been selected by that commission. And he said, Linda, what you have to remember is your principal job is to keep your cool while everyone around you is losing theirs. And that so often really held me in good stead, because, you know, Monday mornings at a courthouse, it's not quiet like this place is in the federal courthouse. It's full of people, nervous people, anxious people, jurors, prosecutors, defendants, pretrial release personnel. There's a lot going on at a county courthouse. on nearly any day of the week, but particularly on, the start of the week. And anyway, that was I enjoyed that give and take with the lawyers. I always enjoyed the intellectual demands of just being a judge and having to decide cases. But particularly, I think, on the domestic side, but also on the criminal side, you have to remind yourself every day that you're seeing people kind of at their worst, that the circumstances that have brought them before you are probably not places that they want to be. Right. And you listen to them, and you pay them respect, and you do what you have to do and hold them accountable if that's what's required. But there's an element of kindness that's required there, and compassion. I think that's important for a judge, and I think I was comfortable in that role.
Well, and again, there's a difference between being soft and, squishy on the law, as opposed to understanding and hard on the law, but easier on the people, as you're trying to explain to them, well, this is the path we're on, and I'm sorry, this is the only path we have.
Right. And I had a wonderful court reporter, Sheila Lastly, who was with me the whole time. And, as a trial judge in this state, you didn't have any other staff except your court reporter, who kind of did everything at the time. And I don't know, I guess a couple times at the end of maybe a divorce trial where there were child custody issues, I would remind the parents that they were always going to be the parents of these children, no matter how things divided up that day or whatever my decision was. And Sheila and I kind of got to calling that my $2 speech, but she would remind me, she said, I think these people are going to need your $2 speech, But I think there's a lot of truth to that. To give them a little hope, going forward, not to just smash people down too much,
Right, and again, at this time, the thought of joint parenting or domestic violence, or a lot of the issues we think about in family dynamics today and have some evidence about, at that time you were doing it based on what you thought or what your psychology degree might have told you, but not necessarily out of any formal training, that you would get from judicial education or CLE. I mean, it was really learning by doing and seeing what was unfolding.
Right. In the early 80s, I became interested in mediation, particularly in the domestic relations realm, and was asked to give a CLE presentation at the State Judges Association, and I think maybe it was on domestic relations law or something, but I decided, I did an outline that had kind of the routine domestic relations, family law sort of stuff, but I decided to do my presentation focused on mediation as an alternate way of resolving family disputes. And I remember at the time, I think probably everybody in the audience thought, what is she talking about? And really, I just had that impression that it didn't go over all that well. But that was pretty early on. Nobody was doing mediation around here in the early 80s.
And I remember that Judge Briles wouldn't go to the state judicial education meetings because the first one she went to, she felt she was treated rather poorly and thought, I don't need to put up with this. So she would always stay behind during those.
You're right, and she would cover everything. And she could do that. Nobody could do that like Margaret could do that. Right. Just cover the whole docket while everybody else was gone. I guess I wasn't aware of that, but you're right. She never was involved in the State Judge Association.
And so as you go, I mean, by then there still weren't all that many women judges, and so
me and Ruth Klotz and Lynn.
And Lynn.
that would be it.
That's it, right.
Yeah. In a room of 200 men, basically, or more.
So you were asking them to shift gears.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I mean, Iowa has adopted that model in a lot of counties, 6th Judicial District and, the Kids First program. And so, I mean, it's now the norm to look at ways to resolve particularly custody and family issues.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, that's been about a 30-year arc in terms of thinking about mediation as a practice, thinking about mediation practices as applied in legal proceedings.
Right.
But really, I mean, you were on the district court like not all that long before you jumped over.
Yeah.
So how did that all come about?
Well, obviously, being asked to do this oral history has made me think about that quite a lot just, recently. And it really started. Clay Legrand, out of the blue, called me one day at the courthouse and said, there's going to be a retirement coming up. Harvey Uhlenhop is getting to retirement age, and you ought to think about applying. Well, I was 38 years old, and I thought, that just didn't seem possible to me, but I thought it was very nice of Clay to call. And then probably a couple months later, Harvey Uhlenhop died unexpectedly while he was still a member of the court. And very shortly after it was announced that he had passed away, I got a call from Ward Reynoldson and Chuck Woolley, both of whom wanted me to get right on it and be thinking about applying. And it sort of stunned me a little bit. I mean, it certainly, none of this being a judge at all had ever been in my life plan. I don't think I had a life plan, but none of this had ever even occurred to me that this would happen. I grew up in Colorado and I was going to be mountain climbing, And here I was in Iowa. Well, I remember going to lunch with Jim Haverkamp, who was then the chief judge of the 7th Judicial District that day. And I mentioned to him that I'd gotten this call from Ward Reynoldson, the chief, and Clay Legrand. And first of all, Jim was really offended that poor Harvey was barely in the grave, when they were calling and thinking about the future of the court. So he's kind of offended about that. And then his next comment to me, as he thought about it a little bit, he said, you really weren't qualified for the job you've got. I guess you'd be good at it. And he said, look what a great job you've done. So, I guess it'd be a good idea. That's so typical.
That's so typical.
Jim Haverkamp,
Jim Haverkamp, that's right.
So, and then I remember having quite a lot of conversation with you, Celeste, at that time, because it is it's an undertaking to mount, the application form for the Supreme Court, to understand the commission process and how that works. But I rolled up my sleeves, and with encouragement from people like you and some other women friends who were really critical at that time, and I'll tell you, I'm such a believer in the collaborative, or the cooperativeness of men and women to get things done. But in this case, I would say the different genders had sort of different roles. But it just so happened that I belonged to this little Episcopal church in Bettendorf, Iowa, and Maggie Tinsman, soon to be a state senator, is a friend of mine, as well as Peg Anderson, who was on the Board of Regents, had led, both of them Republicans. Peg Anderson had been from Cedar Falls, Iowa. She'd been on the school board there. A very well-respected woman, really bright woman, who then led the Iowa ERA movement in Iowa at some point in time. But anyway, she knew a lot of people in Iowa. We were on a canoe trip on the Maquoketa River with our church. And we're waiting for the canoes at the end of the day or something, to get back in the car. And it's a sunny, beautiful day. And I happened to mention to Peg and to Maggie that there'd been some encouragement that I apply for the position on the Supreme Court. And so Peg immediately says, well, where are these nominating commissioners around the state and where do they live? And we literally got out a map out of the car, and I said, well, I understand there's one here and one here and one here. And Peg went to work figuring out who she knew in those different parts of the state, who I should talk to, who might have the ear of the governor or whatever. And anyway, that's how I met Joy Corning, who went on to be the lieutenant governor, because she and Peg had been on the school board together in Cedar Falls.
And only in Iowa.
Only in Iowa.
Right.
But Peg knew a lot of people around the state. And so she made some calls, but mostly she said, here, Linda, these are people you need to talk to around the state. So in addition, and to be honest, I wasn't crazy about the idea of calling up people and telling them who I was, but that's where people like John Carlin help. You don't know it, but they're actually talking to people.
Well, but you still had to. It was 1,000 miles
Yeah.
to hit all of those nominating commissioners, and although it's not political with a capital P, it certainly is social political. Because people want to know that you're normal and that somebody needs to vouch for you.
Exactly, so that's what I did, and it turned out it's such an interesting experience just going to all these places and not having been raised in Iowa. I'd never been to Shenandoah, Iowa before, but it just so happened that two of the commissioners at that time lived in the far southwest reaches of Iowa. And one of them, and they were very nice. I called them up and they said, yeah, come on down and we'd be glad to talk to you. So I drove down there, and one was a lay member of the board, and I assume he was a farmer, super nice guy. I'll never forget, we met at the cafe, the Tall Corn Cafe. The cafe next to the Tall Corn Motel. But he was great and really very encouraging, easy to talk to, and that was fun. Then there was a lawyer in Shenandoah who was also on the commission, and I went to his office that afternoon and had a conversation with him. And the funny thing that I remember about that is that nice lawyer, but not a big conversationalist. And so I was sitting across the desk from him, and there were kind of these gaps in the conversation, and just a little slow, and it was kind of, all of a sudden there was kind of a period of not saying much. And he looked at me and he said, do you like popcorn? And I thought, where's this going exactly? And what else are you going to say? Everybody likes popcorn, right? I said, sure. He said, let's go down to the popcorn factory. So literally we went to I think it's the Vogel Popcorn Factory in Shenandoah, Iowa, and went down there and talked to his buddies on the line at the factory. And I ended up coming home. He introduced me to everybody in the factory, and I ended up coming home with bags of popcorn to share with at home. But I think in retrospect, I viewed that as a positive experience. I wasn't so sure at the time. And
again, that's Iowa.
Yeah. I had another experience in northwest Iowa that was not quite as positive, in the sense that a couple things. A couple of the lay women members of the commission, and of course at that time, that was before gender balanced commission, so of a 15-member commission, all the lawyers were men, and all but one of the lay people were women.
Right.
And there was just a dynamic there that was a little different. And to be honest, a couple of the women that I met, the lawyers had no problem. They knew who I was. Some of them maybe had seen me in court. They'd seen me in a professional light. A couple women, like in northwest Iowa, just couldn't visualize me in that setting, I don't think. And so I went to tea at one person's house, and I just had the distinct feeling that she just couldn't picture me on the bench,
Right.
And some of the questions that they asked were probably inappropriate, but I was able to deflect them. How would I vote on an abortion case and things like that of course judges are prevented from stating opinions on disputed issues of public importance, or at least they were at that time. And so I was able to kind of slide out, or tactfully get out of those things. But anyway, that was the process, and then you actually have the interview itself in the chambers of the Supreme Court, which is kind of a daunting experience itself, the 15 members that you're presenting your story to, but that's a whole nother.
Well, and that was, what month was that? Because it wasn't it?
About June or July.
Yeah, it was
July of
summertime.
1986,
Because it was right around the state bar meeting also, so you kind of felt obliged to go and work that room.
Well, I should mention that, of course, and I forgot this. I'll never forget when one day you came to my chambers at the Scott County Courthouse, and said it was like the last day before you could submit applications, and you mentioned, oh, by the way, I've decided to submit my application for the Supreme Court. And I thought, Celeste, with friends like you, who needs enemies? But you were so committed to that concept of the more women who apply, the better for everybody, and the likelihood that perhaps there'll be a crack in the system.
It was the theory that if you only had one, there was always going to be some excuse to not appoint that one woman. And then if you had more, it would be harder to say, well, you know, she doesn't have trial experience, or she doesn't have this, or she doesn't have that. Now, we've not seen this theory hold at all times, but the idea was that whatever the criteria were, which sometimes were never really articulated, that you could give them somebody that was going to hit some of that, to at least get him in the nominees.
Right.
You know, then you could do political with a capital P if that's what you needed to do or wanted to do. But until you could get those names to the governor couldn't move on that.
Right. One of the other things I remember about that day preliminarily was that I brought along our daughter Emily, and I think she was about 10 years old, 9 or 10, maybe 9. I think the girls were 9 and 5 when I went on the court, but I think she was 9 years old. And, oh gosh, now help me. Who is, having a senior moment, the woman on the Court of Appeals?
Oh, Rosemary.
Rosemary. Yeah, Rosemary Shaw Sackett was on the Court of Appeals, and she had applied for the Supreme Court position. And she looked after Emily while I was in, you know, before the commission, you know, which was great. But yeah, the experience itself was very interesting.
Well, and Justice Harris was the chair, right?
He was, and just the loveliest guy you'd ever want to meet. I mean, he was wonderful, and he took that role so seriously.
And the merit selection process, seriously. I mean, he was a very strong proponent of that, and that everybody would get an equal shot.
Right. And shall I share the story that I just told? I sort of knew the members of the court, but not well. I mean, you'd go to a judges meeting, but we're over here in Scott County, and they're in Des Moines, you know. But Justice Harris called me before the commission, and I think he wanted to just clue me in that he might throw a softball question about, surely it doesn't make any difference that you're a woman. You know, and he just wanted me to be sure I kind of understood that.
That you could answer that.
Yeah, that I could, yeah. And so interestingly enough, he kind of threw this off at the hearing itself. He kind of threw this softball question out. And the first one was something, as I recall, like, Judge Neuman, and of course I'd been a judge for, 6 years at that point, you know. Judge Neuman, have you ever been treated any differently, or as a woman on the bench in Scott County, or you think any of the lawyers ever thought any less of you, or treated you, thought any less of you, I think is sort of what I said. And Bob Waterman, Sr., who happened to be a member of the commission, before I had a chance to answer, he stood up and said, "Absolutely not." And it sort of stunned me, you know. And you know, Bob's kind of a pillar in the legal community at that time. So he sat down, and Justice Harris kind of rephrased the question. And does it really make any difference whether it's a male or female? And it just so happened that at that time, the United States Supreme Court had just decided the case that permitted preemptory challenges that were allegedly based on race. And I'd read that case, and what I said was, what I think is important is that our public institutions are strengthened when when the people who are governing reflect the people who are governed. And so I said, I think it's important for the bench to reflect the society. I said, we are not a homogeneous society, we are a heterogeneous society, men and women, and I think it's probably a good idea. And I said that, and I'm sure Justice Harris kind of thought, oh dear, that isn't where I wanted her to go, but it was how I felt, and I think it's an important concept, I still do. You know, what I still remember then about leaving that interview and driving the 3 hours back to Davenport was I actually heard on Iowa Public Radio that I had been on the slave nominees was announced.
Well.
And of course there'd never been a woman who'd made it that far, so that was big. And then Bob Waterman and another member of the commission, again, pillar of the legal community in Cedar Rapids, that evening, it must have been the evening, because we wouldn't have had it, they couldn't have called me on the phone.
Well, there were no cell
there were no
phones.
cell phones, so that must have been later. But I remember them, maybe after it was announced more publicly or something, they wanted me to know that it wasn't because I was a woman. I was perfectly capable of the job. Thank you very much.
Which was good.
Yeah,
In spite
yeah.
of Jim Haberkamp's thoughts.
That's right. I thought it was interesting that they really did feel compelled, though, to let me know that, because I think there was a worry that she's just being
That there'd be a
out there.
token.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. And they really wanted to let me know that they didn't feel the way, and that was not their vote, which was very kind of them to do.
There were 9 members on the court at that time, even though Clay came up with 10 votes for you.
Right.
But at the time, well, it's still, justices lived in their home communities and then went up for court week and then went up for other work. And so you were up and down the road endlessly.
Right.
It seemed like that to me, and I wasn't doing it.
You're doing it more now.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. No, that was a big, our life for 17 years, our family life, ended up being kind of oriented towards, what we called crisis day. I should explain to you, I should just give a little background. Iowa was one of the few states that had what was called a deflective appeal system, where all appeals are to the Iowa Supreme Court, and then we deflected cases to the Court of Appeals. And typically, we met 1 week a month in face-to-face, and we heard all of the arguments in 1 week. And typically, it was 3 cases. We were assigned 3 cases per judge, so you have at least 27 arguments every month, and 3 opinions that you'd be assigned to write. And so the Wednesday before court week was always crisis day. And so, you're always trying to get your opinions done so they'd be circulated. And so my family just got used to it's crisis day, this is crisis week. Because then you're not only preparing your own opinions, but you're reading the 24 other opinions that are being circulated and preparing to vote on them, perhaps writing special concurrences or dissents or whatever. And then we'd all troop to Des Moines on Monday. You'd hear cases on all day Monday and Tuesday morning. Then you'd have committee work, because the court was responsible for administrative work, so we'd have administrative committee meetings on Tuesday afternoons. On Wednesday would be our case conference, and this would be all the cases that were just circulated. Now bear in mind, in addition to preparing those opinions, then you've also got to prepare for the new cases that are coming up. So you've somewhere along after crisis day, between Saturday and Wednesday and Sunday, you were reading the briefs for the cases that were coming up that you were going to be hearing. So you're hearing the new cases, then you're talking about the cases that have been circulated, the opinions. And then on Thursday and Friday, there would be more arguments. When I first got on the court, there were 9 members of the court, and they were so overworked, really. They had so many opinions because the Court of Appeals was very undersized. So they really took more cases than a typical court of last resort would take, largely because the Court of Appeals just couldn't handle that volume. So we actually sat in panels of 5 instead of as a full court. And then after an opinion was circulated, anyone could ask the court the decision to be decided in bank. And so then if you hadn't sat on the case the first time, then you'd be listening to the arguments on tape and then reading the briefs, and it would be decided as a court in bank.
So they wouldn't get to re-argue it if it went en banc?
Right. Right.
Okay.
It would just be decided as a matter of court. Everybody would look at the case before it was decided. Well, when you think about it, when I first got on the court in 1986, they did that 12 months a year. And then, in addition to that writing, of preparing for new cases, writing old ones, then there were all the further review petitions that we were studying that had to be decided and thrown into the mix. So a couple days a week were devoted, a couple days a month were devoted to reviewing stacks of further review petitions, mostly in criminal cases, but a lot of domestic cases actually. And there was a separate, there were 3-judge panels to do that. And then there's motion practice. I mean, it's a lot of work, and there's no pulling out of it. As a trial judge, you could take a vacation and somebody else, you didn't hear anything, so you go on vacation. On Supreme Court, you got to be there, and because nobody else is going to take your place. And after a couple years, it had been like that for a long time in the court, and after a couple years, the court realized that their staff was accumulating unused vacation days because they never knew how to pull out of that system, really. So, so somewhere along the way, they changed so we didn't, like maybe in August, we didn't have court week or something, you know. But basically, that was it. So every month, you'd be assigned your 3 cases, you'd do all this work, and you'd turn on the opinions, and they'd be voted on, and then the next week they'd hand you 3 more to get up to speed on, and you do that every month of the year, and I did that for 17 years. It's a lot of work.
And it's a lot, no electronic filing, so you're hauling boxes of stuff.
I was writing out for many, many, many years, till pretty close to when I retired in 2003. I was writing out all of my opinions in longhand on a yellow pad. I never had a secretary in Davenport. My secretary was always in Des Moines, so I would dictate opinions to her. Early on, they would send them back on these old TWX machines that clattered away, you know, and then, you'd make corrections and call, dictate, and I was always going back and forth between Des Moines and home. And that's how, before we had computers, all the opinions of all my colleagues that would show up like the day after crisis day, you'd have a pile of them to read, they were all just in paper, just hard copy. And then as errors were found, because the idea was we would each call and say, did you really mean to say this? Or I could go along with this opinion, but I can't buy this argument. Here's what I think I ought to do, or whatever, different changes. Those would come in like one sheet at a time in the mail. So you or your one law clerk is kind of try to put that stuff together, and so you can be on top of it for Monday for the new cases and Wednesday for a discussion of all the pending cases. And we had what Art McGivern, the chief, used to call the hit parade. You never wanted to be at the top of the hit parade because what that meant was you had carried over a case for a month or two, And Art McGivern would never be at the top of the hit parade because he always got his work done. He used to have a clean desk policy. He used to say,
bless his heart.
It was a wonderful, exceptional, really, intellectual experience, because I had really good colleagues, and they were really hard workers. They were all super conscientious, and they took their positions very seriously, but they were not at all ideological in their approach to cases. They really looked at every case, and although we would have differences of opinions on things, all of the discussion at our case conference was always very professional. And I so appreciated that, The way it worked would be that after we'd hear the cases, the arguments in the courtroom, then we'd come back and we would have a case conference about the new opinion that was kind of tentative in nature, kind of where the person who was assigned to write the case would kind of gather the thoughts of everybody else. And then the final decision-making was at a month later at the actual case conference. If there were opinions that were circulated that everybody was in agreement on, then there was no need to discuss them. But otherwise, the opinions were discussed, and it was very routinized in the sense that the person who had authored the opinion spoke first, and then it just went around the table and nobody talked until everybody had a chance to talk, which was great. There was no, you weren't arguing with people,
Right, it wasn't posturing, or it wasn't trying to gather votes,
right,
as you may.
Yeah. Now, ultimately, once that first thing went around, then people could kind of, start debating back and forth. I remember one time, and I should step back, I didn't realize when I was appointed to the court that not only do you have an assigned seat on the bench, but you have an assigned seat in the conference room. Jerry Larson called me up one day before I became a member of the court, and he said, "Oh, do you know where you're going to sit?" And I pictured on the bench. He said, "No, you're going to be sitting next to me." And that's where Harvey Uhlenhop had sat before he died. And I sat next to Jerry Larson for 17 years, a week a month, basically,
Same alphabetical.
Well, yes, L and yeah. No, and there's actually, and I think maybe you sent it to me or somebody did, there's actually a matrix that shows who is sat in those seats, the succession of the chart of the seats around the conference table. So on the one hand, as I say this, it all sounds so rigid, but it's also a very sort of pleasant and intellectually challenging experience, and I had great colleagues, you know, the whole time. So, so it was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun. But as you started out asking me, it was not an easy thing for my family, because then I was in Des Moines, you know, for at least a week a month for 17 years. And but again, Henry, you know, stepped up. He was great. I think over those years, he became closer to the girls than the sort of average dad. That's really stereotyping, but I think it was at a time. Things have kind of changed that way. I think dads are much more involved now, it's my observation, than they were in the 80s, early 80s, let's say, 80s and 90s. So it was really cool. And I would, in addition to crisis day, preparing opinions, getting ready for the new court week, packing your suitcase, all that kind of stuff, I, of course, felt compelled to make meals for them so that they would have something to eat. I learned after a few years that they usually went to the country club or out to Happy Joe's Pizza or something instead of eating the things I prepared. I thought, there is no point in my doing that.
Why am I knocking myself out?
Exactly,
Yes.
you know. And honestly, over that period of time, you know, when I went on the court, my girls were 5 and 9, our girls, and when I retired, they were 22 and 26. And you think, how did we do that exactly as a family? But I had wonderful caregivers and women who cleaned my house and took the girls to tennis lessons and taught them how to drive and took them to music lessons. And it was wonderful. I mean, we were really, you know, lucky that way to have, my girls were great. People didn't mind helping out, taking care of them. So that was good. And the flip side of it is that in the 3 weeks when I wasn't in Des Moines for court week, clearly there was a lot of work to be done in terms of the research and writing of opinions, all the administrative stuff we have to do, all the reading. But I did that at the Scott County Courthouse. They gave me an office there, which was great. But particularly as the girls got older, if they were in a track meet or a tennis meet or cross-country meet or something, I could leave the courthouse at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and get to the meet. It wasn't like I had to be in trial.
Right.
I had a lot of work to do, but I could do that when they went to bed. I could do it on Saturdays and Sundays and stuff. And, you know, that has two sides to it. It was a big deal. We would never go anywhere on a family vacation that I wasn't reading briefs. And if on occasion I wasn't, the girls thought that was pretty special, that I was actually paying attention to them, you know. I'll tell you a funny story. One time we were out at the house in Colorado, and it was the week between Christmas and New Year's, and we had further review decisions to make. So we're there in Colorado, and the UPS guy delivers 2 big, you know, copy paper boxes full of briefs. And I open the door, and he looks in, and here's the Christmas tree, and here's the kids, you know. And he looks at the box, and he says, "This is work, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "For $10, I'll pretend like you never saw it." Sorry, can't do that. And year after year, you know, be the same guy, the same FedEx guy, who would come and say, "Sorry, it looks like you guys are, you know, you're still working," or whatever. But that was just the nature of the beast.
That just became normal, and in a way it was good that the kids would see that, well, this is normal. And I mean, I can remember taking one of my daughters and her friend down to work on a Saturday, and we had microphones in the courtroom, so I was in chambers and I could hear them. And the other girl's mom was a doctor, and they were playing lawyer and doctor. I thought, well, good for you, you know, that you think that that's just how it is.
Yeah, well, you know, and I've told the story about how, you know, my girls really grew up thinking all judges were women. One day I was taking Judge Jim Kelly home from work. He asked if he could catch a ride with me, and I said, "Yeah, that's great, but we've got to stop and pick up Emily at the daycare." And so I went in and got Emily, and I said, "Now you have to, you know, I want you to behave, be nice, behave, because Judge Kelly, we're taking Judge Kelly home." And Emily immediately said, "Well, where's she going to sit?" You know, it never occurred to her that Judge Kelly would not be a woman. So, you know, that was a cool part of it.
Well, when you were on the Supreme Court, you got your master's. So, like, in addition to all of this other stuff, it's like, hey, let's go to Virginia and get a master's, get an LLM. So I mean, yes, we like a challenge, we like new things, but you were already on a lot of committee work, both locally and nationally, and so why did you layer that on?
Good question.
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
And it was a marvelous experience. Well, somewhere along the way, I was the chair of the Appellate Judges Conference of the American Bar Association, and I was on the board of the directors of the National Association of Women Judges, and in retrospect, I think, what was really, we pile all that on top of the regular, but I enjoyed meeting the people. Again, I enjoyed the challenge of that and kind of the administrative piece. I learned an awful lot that I think was beneficial to the administration of the Iowa Supreme Court based on my connections outside. And certainly it was Ward Reynoldson who kind of started that and kind of got me on the road at the American Bar Association and ultimately the chair of the Appellate Judges Conference. But the ABA had started this program that Mark McCormick was the former graduate, for appellate judges, really, to get their LLM at the University of Virginia. And over the years, because I just decided, the girls were older, they were like high school, college age, and I just decided that would something I would like to do. And I suppose I was thinking ahead a little bit in terms of maybe some potential opportunities to use that as a vehicle to do some teaching at the University of Iowa or someplace later. And so I applied and was accepted to that program. And it was really wonderful. It was 6 weeks at the University of Virginia with amazing professors, but also living in a little apartment, student housing sorts of things with some wonderful judges from around the country that I got to know. A couple federal judges, Mike Hawkins from the Ninth Circuit, and a couple federal trial judges, but then the rest were either Court of Appeals judges from around the country or Supreme Court judges. And it was great. So it was real intense. Interestingly, many other courts around the country, appellate courts, would kind of take the summer off or use that as a catch-up time or something. Not the Iowa Supreme Court. So I was writing opinions as well as studying, and it was a lot of reading. I think the professors there were surprised that we were also conscientious about reading every single word.
Yeah.
We just did, and there were exams. It was a real, sort of a deal. Regular classwork. I got well acquainted with 3 judges in particular. We got into a routine of walking every morning. One was on the Florida Court of Appeals, one was the chief judge of the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals, and one was Mike Hawkins on the Ninth Circuit. And we'd meet at 6 o'clock in the morning because class started like at 7:30 or 8 or something,
Okay.
So we'd walk. And they'd all, I remember these conversations where we'd all been up till 2 reading, and we loved what we were reading. It's so fun as a grown-up professional to
Right.
be able to go back to school and see things and learn things that you hadn't really thought about before. But we'd all be exhausted. We'd say, "Really? Were you up that late too?" Yeah, we all were. But we grew to be good friends. It was really interesting work, and so that was 2 summers and then a thesis. And my particular interest at that time was the relationship and the communications between the branches of government. And part of that had really come out of the commission that I think kind of simultaneously, or very same time, was chairing the Supreme Court Commission on Planning for the 21st Century.
Right.
And that probably was one of the most interesting experiences I had on the court, and probably most important when you at least thought about it from that time frame and how important that was for the future of the court at that time. Because I don't want to say we were backward, but there was virtually no technology. I went to a meeting, and this would be early 90s, mid 90s probably, and I was asked to be on a strategic planning committee for the American Bar Association and the Appellate Judges Conference. And I happened to mention to these 2 judges, like one's the chief judge of the Indiana Supreme Court, and I don't know who was on the other side, but I happened to mention that I was still writing my opinions out in longhand on a yellow pad. And that became sort of the joke of the weekend. Linda's still writing her opinions with a number, HB 10 pencil on a yellow pad. Well, in the Commission on the Future of the Courts in Iowa, becoming a not only business-like but a technologically, established system was really going to be important. And so there were a couple members of that on the commission that heard that story, and they just rounded up an old computer for me to have, at the Scott County Courthouse, so that I could sort of begin doing that. By that time, the law clerks had some kind of old computers, but none of the judges did. So that was kind of early on that I could actually do some of my communicating with Des Moines on my own, and I think I was the only member of the court who did that at that time. But that whole commission was really important because it was structured in a way. Tom Urban, the former CEO of Pioneer, and I were the co-chairs. And we spent a lot of time choosing who was going to be on this commission. And I was thinking about it the other day. Tom Vilsack was on that commission, now Secretary of Agriculture, former governor. Mary Kramer, ultimately an ambassador. Oh gosh, I'm sure I had a list. They were interesting people, but they were also, Tom Urban, for example, got hold of some of his managers and said, who do you know who's a really top flight farmer out there who could be on this commission? And anyway, it was very broadly based. There were teachers and legislators and lawyers and judges, and they were all really committed to the process, and we were able to hire a planner from Portland, Oregon, actually, who was just wonderful. We had to raise the money to do that, and as it turns out, Ted Hutchinson, who is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Principal, was sort of the lead person to raise money for us, and he got the Association of Business and Industry to give us 3 times the money that the legislature did. As I recall, he managed to get $150,000 from the business leaders in the state, whereas the legislature only gave us $50,000 to do it. But what he was hearing from, for example, I was thinking, he was talking to the CEO of Hy-Vee, and that CEO said, we have employees and customers who are involved in the state courts every week of the year. And it's important to us in our business that the courts operate in a business-like way. And we think this is a great idea. I can remember at one of the meetings, a fellow who was an executive in one of the hospital systems, he said, I've really got to commend the courts for doing this. He said, the health industry really needs to do this, and it just won't do it. Now, this was 1995, but he said, the hospital industry just won't do it. So this is, I commend you for it. And the fellow who came on board at Tom Urban's behest, who was a farmer, after he'd done the work for a while, he said, what I realized is cranking out cases isn't all that different from processing turkeys. He said, I didn't think I had anything to offer here, but I think I really do. So it was such an interesting and challenging experience, and it brought a lot of people together, and I think it brought a lot of focus on the courts to people who had never really thought about it before. And the court really used it as a template. I know, Mike Gartner was on it, and there were some really notable people on the commission who agreed to serve, and they really did. They really came to the meetings. They met in small groups. Ultimately, we put together an interesting plan of action, strategic goals, and also more tactical things. And the court used that probably for a good 10 years in terms of strategizing how to get money from the legislature, how to build do the court's work in a more business-like way. But probably as important as anything was the relationships that developed during the course of that. And it occurred to me in thinking about it that it ultimately led, I chaired a separate committee later on talking about the size of the court and the imbalance we had between the Court of Appeals, which was only 6, and the Supreme Court, which was 9. And when we studied it, we found that although we look at the United States Supreme Court and they have 9 members, so you sort of think, well, all courts ought to have 9 members. What we learned from doing a lot of research was that 7 is perhaps a better number for decision making, and a lot of courts have only 7. And basically what was happening at the same time was the legislature wanted us very much to get out of the state capitol because they wanted that space. So kind of unbeknownst to the Bar Association, and that became a little bit of an issue, but we sort of worked a deal. Mary Kramer had been on this commission, Tom Vilsack had been on this commission. They knew the needs of the court system. We understood what they were trying to do. We sort of worked a deal with, okay, we've got 9 members of our court. 4 we're going to be having retirements within the next 4 years. 2 right away, actually. We'd like to have 9 members on the Court of Appeals, and we will reduce down to 7 if you will help pass legislation to do that. And at the same time, by the way, we'd be willing, if you'd be willing to build us a new court building, we'd get out of your way. And that all kind of came together because of the relationships that were developed between the members of this commission and the court. And when the Bar Association got wind of this, they were not happy about it because they weren't in on it. And the thought of reducing the Supreme Court from 9 to 7 was a concern to them. But ultimately that kind of blew over, and we said, sorry, this was an opportunity and we're going to take it. And so the judicial branch was built. We were able to reduce the size of the Supreme Court without a lot of trauma at the time because we just went, one retirement wasn't filled, one retirement wasn't filled, then there were 2 others and they were replaced, but then there was a court of 7. So it worked out remarkably smoothly. It just, the planets kind of aligned to do all that.
The reducing the size of the court is something I've always wondered about because it seemed like one day there were 9 and the next day there were 7, and I missed the memo or something because it really didn't seem like there had been a lot of debate or discussion on the bar side of it.
Right.
But how did it change the dynamics of decision making?
Great.
Because you were getting a couple new members at the time, it wasn't just reducing your membership, it was...
We got 2 new members eventually, but the important thing, and what really sold the members of the court on it after having done a lot of research, we no longer had to have these split court sessions. We all heard all the cases, and that was really valuable because there was always a little bit of a sense, frankly, that when the court was 9 and you were hearing in panels of 5, if you hadn't heard the argument, and if someone weren't conscientious about listening to the tape of the argument or going back and reading the briefs, you really had 4 members of the court when it was in bank that weren't quite as up to speed as the 5 were, and there was a potential for kind of different split at lots of things. So it was really made a lot more sense to have the court as 7, and so that was a good thing. And then of course the Court of Appeals, most appellate decisions you're applying settled law to new facts. And those are the kinds of cases that are supposed to go to a Court of Appeals, but we were retaining many more of those just not to burden them. So the court now, and to be honest, now I think it's a little the opposite extreme. they were seriously burdening the Court of Appeals, but it really transformed the court a little more into a certiorari court, so that we kept cases that were obvious for Supreme Court decision, but there was sort of a couple classes of cases that, unless there was something particularly unusual or some particular constitutional question that was raised, they would go to the Court of Appeals. But then they could field 3, panels at any given time, and they were more equipped to do that. So, from a decision-making standpoint, I think was probably a really good move. The other thing that came out, one of the other things that became evident from the Commission's report was that the people of the state in the state of Iowa didn't really know their judges. And the Bar Association just had the plebiscite that said yes or no, should this judge be retained? And there was more and more pressure around the country. We as judges, we're getting letters, it was before email, I guess, but that was sort of building. We're getting letters from other states that said, look we targeted this judge in this state because they were against the death penalty. We can do the same thing to you, or something like that. So there was a movement within the Bar Association to think of a different way of vetting judges in a way that the public would have some idea of who it was that they were voting for. There were a lot of systems in place around the country that were pretty complex and pretty expensive. For example, in Colorado, they actually had lay people come in and watch trials and all that, court watchers sort of stuff. Well, the Bar Association didn't really want to do that. We really looked at all of the options and decided
hard to sustain.
Exactly. So for really a number of election cycles, but particularly with the first one, I was involved with a group of lawyers and judges who drafted questions that they thought were important for lawyers to vet judges on. So then that was proposed. So that became very controversial among the Judges Association because they were afraid that judges would be plunked, or whatever they call it, that lawyers would just be real negative about them, and it would be awful. And I will never forget, we had a meeting in the ballroom at the
Fort Des Moines.
The old Fort Des Moines, yes, full of judges. And there was all this controversy going on about it, and the board of directors of the Judges Association was opposed to it. And I got up and extemporaneously, and I'm not a great extemporaneous speaker, but I thought I'd been the chair of the Appellate Judges Conference of the United States. I've been involved in a lot of the, I saw judges from around the country, and I thought, we have great judges here, and they have nothing to fear, and the lawyers are decent. And if there's a criticism, great, but they're not gonna, but if you give them an opportunity to say, yeah, if this judge were a little more punctual, I'd be happier, rather than just saying yes or no.
Right.
And anyway, I got up there and I gave my little spiel that they should be proud and not worried about this, that this was really a good move. What I regret, and I guess I don't mind having this on tape, but we had discussed this around our conference table of the court, and yet at that meeting, Lou Laverado, who was then the chief, voted against it. He sided with the board of the Judges Association, and I guess that's why, but that kind of irked me. Well, the vote was so close that they, what do they call, they had to call for, not a divided house, what do you call that when people had to stand up and actually, it wasn't just like a yay or nay, it was, okay, the house is divided, we need to actually count. And it was a very close vote, but the new system prevailed, the new system that we're all familiar with now. Exactly. And of course, what happened when that was circulated among the lawyers in the following election cycle, the judges ranked higher than they'd ever had before. There were more yes votes for keeping judges than there had ever been before. And it was a great public relations thing for the Bar Association, the Judges Association to say, know your judges, that kind of thing. So, I felt good about that. But I think, again, that was something that kind of came out of that commission, that whole study. Yeah.
Now, I know one tradition that the court had while you were there was the Wednesday night dinner that, one member would plan, but, you would all commit to attending.
Absolutely.
And I think that is important in terms of building some collegiality and just the kind of social capital or the ability to speak more in shorthand to each other because you've seen each other in a more relaxed setting, so that it's not always just all 9 in the same order with the same legal pad at the table. I mean, is that true? I mean, was that part of that tradition?
Yeah, absolutely. And that tradition had been it had been a tradition for a long time, I think, before I came on the court. It was designed to be on Wednesday night after you'd had this case conference, and some people's feelings sort of get hurt if they thought they were writing the majority opinion and it turned out they weren't, or something. And as I said, those were always professional arguments, but they were pretty hard fought too. Right. So this was kind of thought to be a sort of a bury the hatchet night. But it turned out to be a way, as you say, to get to know one another more informally, to get to know the spouses. Because there was a time when all the spouses always came to those dinners. Right. And sometimes they would host them at their hotel where they were staying, if they got a suite at the Hotel Fort Des Moines. We only ever got, like $35 a night for our expenses, so you kind of had to, if you're going to get a suite. They were real nice at the Hotel Fort Des Moines, giving the judges suites for very realistic prices. But it was an important part. And Henry would troop over, from Des Moines, particularly if it was my turn to host. I guess as I think about it, he often didn't make it because he was home.
With the girls.
Yeah, with the girls, But that was really, that was an important bit of collegiality. And I understand they don't do that now, which is too
I
bad.
think it is too bad.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can remember when you would come up for that week, and sometimes we could get together and sometimes we couldn't, but Wednesday was off the table. I mean, it was never going to be Wednesday night.
Right, yeah.
But I think you have to make a little space for that. Otherwise, you're just always seeing people at work and you're never seeing them in what I would call like a state of grace.
That's a great way to put it. And let me tell you that I was going to mention that when with the work that I did with the ABA with appellate judges from around the country, I came to learn that in some places, I was so grateful that our court was as collegial as it was, because I learned that in some places, people's egos, they were so sensitive about discussing opinions that they simply didn't have any case conference. People wrote their opinions, and if somebody didn't like it, they'd write a dissent. And there was no discussion about the opinions. And that was unfathomable to me, because that was always the most interesting part of being a member of the court, was listening to your colleagues debate the merits of a case. I remember one time I had some opinion out there, and Ward Reynoldson, he always sat to my right, because he was at the head of the table, and Jim Carter and somebody else were sort of on my side, or Jim Carter was kind of arguing for my position. And I remember Ward kind of leaning over, he said, "Isn't it great to have a lawyer that good on your side," or something? But that was kind of it. There was a lot of advocacy that went on the court in those sessions, and it was really fun. And if you had everybody piled up against you, it was not so much fun,
That's true.
But no, I mean, I just think that gives the ability to, I guess, give somebody the benefit of the doubt, or to be dialed into what else might be going on with them, personally or professionally, particularly if you're on a lot of national committees or doing the future planning. It's not always just crisis week, crisis, followed by a half hour and then gearing up again.
Yeah, we would pause and enjoy one another's company. And I mean, I remember one night, and of course there were a lot of nights, a lot of those court partners over 17 years. But one night we were in, happened to be Wednesday night when the Gulf War started. And I sort of remember Art McGivern. Now, Art McGivern and Dave Harris and Jim Andreessen and Lou Laverato had all had some military, sort of backgrounds. And I remember Art saying so sternly, as he would, he said, "Linda, we're at war." I'm just, but it was because we had the TV going, we were at somebody's suite at the Hotel Fort Des Moines or something, that was important.
But who did you stay with when you came up?
Oh, for most of those years, I stayed with Joy Corning. As I mentioned earlier, I met Joy in the nomination sort of process because she knew people. And so she had an apartment. At first, I just stayed I stayed at the Drake Inn a lot. It was brand new at the time, and I would often go there. But two other things. So then Joy, she was a state senator and then lieutenant governor, but somewhere in there, she was widowed. Her husband of many years died of a heart attack. So she had a 2-bedroom apartment on Grand Avenue and asked if I would like to come and stay with her, and literally, I think we got $35 a night for housing, and I would give Joy the $35 a night, and but it was great. I mean, it was a wonderful relationship, and over those 17, probably 15 years at least. Then my friend Maggie Tinsman, who I mentioned, she was elected to the Senate, and then so she got an apartment in Des Moines for the legislative session from January till April or May or whenever they finished. Yeah, and so she encouraged me during those months, would I please stay with her. Maggie's a long friend, not as easy to live with as Joy, and that was I love Maggie, but she's a challenge. Her family said, now, Maggie really likes to process things, so be prepared for this. She would come back from legislative stuff, like at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and I'm ready to hit the sack and get ready for the next day of court, and she'd want to process. She'd want, and so that became sort of a joke. But on the other hand, that was for many, many years, because she was in the Senate the whole rest of the time I was on the court. So those months I'd stay with her often.
But I thought that was interesting, going back to your thesis about cooperation among the branches of government.
Yes.
And that that was kind of an Iowa thing to do, that nobody would question two branches of government living together.
Both executive, and legislative. I hadn't thought about that, sure.
Yeah, and that I really do think, particularly in the early 80s, there was a very interesting group of women in the legislature that worked, in a bipartisan way to target, whether it was children and family issues or voting issues or fairness issues. And, Maggie and, Betty Shaw started in the legislature. Just, Mary Kramer, that group of, if we need a law, we'll get a law. That was really the attitude, and once a year the women judges would meet with the women legislators.
Yeah.
And it was always just a very interesting dinner about, what do you do and why do you do it that way? It wasn't any partisan issue. It really was more curiosity about why do you take that approach to problem solving.
Absolutely. And, I recall well the time we all went to Mitchellville to the women's prison for a tour, and it was women legislators and women judges. And kind of really an eye-opening experience for all of us to see what it was really like there. And one thing I'd like to mention that came up on the court kind of related to this, and probably because I had this close connection with someone in the Senate and someone in the executive branch, and chatting about things, there was a real push, and I suppose it was in the mid-90s, to reassert the death penalty in Iowa. And it was big. It was kind of sweeping the country, and Iowa was like every place else. And there were a lot of debates in the House and Senate about it, and a lot of pressure. And as a court, we knew that we couldn't weigh in on the moral question of whether there should be a death penalty in Iowa. But we knew, and I knew in particular from my colleagues in states that did have the death penalty, how much time they were spending as an appellate court on death penalty litigation. And it was phenomenal, really, the amount of time that's devoted, the time and expense. And so we asked the staff to put together some data that we might share with the legislature about our concerns that if they decided to go with the death penalty, the kind of impact that would have on the judicial branch in Iowa. And we had some good data for that. And one of the senior staff members wrote that up, and then we decided to send a letter to the legislature. And I think one of the staff members drafted it, and then I said, I think we could be a little more persuasive here in the writing, so to be honest, I kind of rewrote it, and not rewrote, but, kind of made it more, tweaked it up a little bit, and made it a pretty powerful sort of piece from us. Not at all on the political or moral issues, but purely the impact on the judiciary and had they thought about that. And it was an important time for the court, because that was a very direct communication between the court and the legislature that ordinarily would not be done. And I'm not sure if Lou was probably Art McGivern would have been the chief, but I remember somebody asking, well, who should sign the letter? And there was sort of a general agreement that we would all sign it. Opinions are only signed by one member of the court, but all the members of the court, and it would have been 9, I think, at that time, all signed this letter to the legislature. Well, Maggie in particular said when that hit every desk of every member of the House and Senate, that meant something to them, and it was significant in the decision making. That year, it's my understanding, as I recall, that the states in which the legislatures had voted for the death penalty, it was vetoed in many states by their governor. But in Iowa, it was actually defeated in the legislature. And there were lots of other organizations, obviously, that were weighing in on that. But I just remember that sort of feeling of kind of power that we were speaking as a court, and each one of us joined on that letter. I still have that letter because I used it as a sort of an example in my master's thesis at the University of Virginia. Because ordinarily, courts and the other branches of government don't really communicate very directly. It's real. They don't. I mean, in an opinion, you might, because you're required, there are lots of rules of statutory interpretation, and you might think, wow, what were they thinking of when they did this? But this is what they said, so we have to presume this is what they meant. But you might say something in opinion that suggests they might think about doing something a different way. Well, whether they ever really read those or not, you kind of wonder. I'm sure the Legislative Service Bureau does and so forth. And then occasionally they'll be unhappy with something and they will zing back with some statute that addresses that issue directly, and maybe even a particular case. And that's really not the way things should be done, But anyway, the communication is not very direct. And so that intrigued me. And that was one time when I felt that we really communicated quite directly.
And again, I think that was a very Iowa, let's set the political issue aside, but let's look at the practical part of this. And if that's what you want, how do you think that's going to happen? And which is a logical next question, but not one you always get to ask or have people document their thought process about that.
Right.
Kind of like going from 9 to 7.
Yes. Yeah.
But again, I mean, it's systems thinking. I mean, it's bigger process thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so throughout all this time, it wasn't like you just kind of let things here in the Quad Cities slide. You were still active on boards and Girl Scouts and...
Well, I couldn't, once I went on the district court bench, I really had to give all that up. And so I really wasn't on any, I did a lot with children, but I wasn't on any boards because that really was not permitted. However, rather late on my career on the Supreme Court, there was kind of a move, throughout, let's say, the ABA again. I'm thinking of Danelle Tahoe, who was on the 10th Circuit, who was at that time, and she chaired the Appellate Judges Conference. She felt, again, this idea that the people need to know who judges are, and they are community citizens and so forth. So that in certain situations, you shouldn't feel like you have to get off of, uninvolve yourself in every community activity you've ever been on just because you're a judge, so long as those activities aren't going to regularly come before the court.
Right.
So at some point I was asked to be on the board of directors, the board of trustees of St. Ambrose University. And I decided, yeah. And my thinking at the time was, it's probably good for them to know that a judge is an okay person and they have common sense or something, So anyway, I agreed to be on that board, and that didn't present any conflicts, or anything. And I ended up being on that board of trustees for 15 years, long after I retired from the court, and it was real nice. You were a graduate of St. Ambrose, and you had children who went to St. Ambrose, daughter. And so that was a nice opportunity, and again, an opportunity for me to, get back in touch. It's pretty easy as a judge to get pretty far removed from the lawyers, the people in your community. And that's unfortunate.
I do think that's one of the nice things about when the office was in the Scott County Courthouse, because people would, I grew up with Justice Legrand, and I started as a prosecutor, so he was literally in the next office. Mm-hmm. And so you'd stop and you'd say hi, and you would talk to him as much as his judicial assistant, but you'd have a conversation in the hall or down at the snack bar. And I think the more young lawyers particularly get to know that the Supreme Court is just regular old people,
Right.
And then that makes you think, well, I could do that job, or that is something that would be available to me in this community, and it's not, you don't have to go to Des Moines and no one ever sees you again.
Right.
Which, without some effort on your part, people wouldn't see you again.
Right. I think the history of the court in that idea that you didn't, well, let me back up. most Supreme Courts in the United States of America, if your capital is Indianapolis, everybody moves to Indianapolis. And our court was always structured so that there was at least limited amount of budget for travel, so that there was kind of this representative feel. So everybody, when I first went on the court, Lou Laverado lived in Des Moines. He was the only one. And everybody else traveled. And so then we structured our time together so that we didn't have to travel all the time. We could be there for one real intense week, and otherwise we were communicating mostly by telephone. If there were particular committee things or projects going on, you'd go back and forth a couple times. But some months it was really just that 1 week. That, of course, kind of shifted when there was a change on the court, and now most of them are from Des Moines. They don't realize that that's a long trip. It's 6 hours that you're spending in the car when you could be reading briefs or doing other things, And so it was I was grateful. And that was really one of the only reasons that I could even consider it, because Henry wasn't going to be moving to Des Moines. His law practice was in Davenport. So that worked for me. But also I think systemically it was system-wise, it was a good thing for the court, because we kind of had our pulse on what was going on in the local district court.
Right, and I really do think that makes a difference in the perception of the bar, that you do have a clue about county seat practice.
Yeah.
And I think the perspective of the court that, whether courthouses have to close because there's no money, if your office is in that building, you see that impact much more directly than if you're making that decision, just more abstractly.
Another feature of the court that played into that was that over the years that I was on the court, the great majority of the members of the Supreme Court had all been trial judges. And that makes a difference too. It really does, because you know what it's like calling the balls and strikes, when you're in the courtroom. Or the limits on staffing that we always had. And as I said, the court reporter was the only staff I ever had.
Right, and that if you had one law clerk for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
It was the ratio was about 1 to 8, 1 to 10.
Yeah.
And so the thought that, well, you know what you know, or the books you have, or that's the
books you have.
Got, and,
yeah. So the time while I was on the court, there was a progression of thinking many of those things weren't as important, and I felt like I was sort of a voice for the judges out there, who were experiencing the situation on the ground in their own places, and there was a little tension about that on the court, but by and large, they were great, and I had really wonderful colleagues over the years. So that was a really satisfying, rewarding part of the position, actually, to be so welcome from the first day, and just to be accepted for who you are and your thoughts and ideas. I never felt like I had to prove myself to anybody, and so which was wonderful, and so that made it really nice.
So, talk about two things. While you were on the court, where did you get your law clerks, or how did you find law clerks, or how did they find you?
You just get applications. People start writing you letters. And in the olden days, before computers, people really had to think about sending a letter. They didn't.
They weren't.
Paper everybody in the United States of America, every judge, So most of my clerks mostly came from Iowa or from Drake. I had some real good clerks I had a great clerk from WashU and one from, a couple from WashU, actually. Once they find out that, there's somebody in Iowa who would think about hiring someone from Washington University, then, they tell their friends, and you might have a little spate of activity from a different place. But I could never get anybody from Colorado to come to Iowa to be my clerk. And so I think almost all of them were from one of those three places, if I recall correctly. You connected me with a great law clerk, someone who I think had maybe interned in your office, Mike Forrest.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. He was a great clerk. I was talking to somebody just recently about what's the key characteristic of a really wonderful assistant, and that is that they think of things that you haven't thought of. I would sometimes have law clerks, and they were all fabulous, but once in a while you'd have one that's like, and I'd want to say, tell me something I don't already know, Right. But Mike Forrest was great about just thinking of things ahead.
Right.
He was just particularly good at that. So, and he was I had him for a couple of years because it was during that period of time when I was both getting my LLM at the University of Virginia and also chairing the Commission on the Future of the Courts in Iowa. And we put together a book that he taught himself how to do, the publisher, whatever it was, so that he actually set it up. He was great. Mm-hmm. So he carried a lot of weight. But we always only had one, right. Just one elbow clerk. And then there was a wonderful staff of attorneys at the court who also assisted in a lot of the motion practice, right. And also editing opinions and things. But that group has really been decimated as far as I can tell. When I look at the staff that they have in the Supreme Court now, I think, how did they get any work done? I mean, they hardly have anybody left with all the various budget cuts over the years. So.
Right, and they've given up, to shift and to shift budget, and it's a pretty flat organization.
Oh my, absolutely. Yeah. And even at the time when I was involved, I think my recollection would be like 2% of the state budget went to the judiciary, the judicial branch. I think that's all it was. It was really small then.
It's not enough.
No.
To really do the quality work product that people expect and that they continue to get.
Yeah.
They get it because people work so hard.
They do. It's remarkable. The kind of quality that you get. But again, it's kind of an Iowa thing. You get a job like that and you take it seriously and you do it.
That's right.
Yeah.
But so during, one of the things, or a couple things that have been rather consistent themes is mediation and your interest in mediation and meditation. And the work that you've done with your parish and the church, and so how you've been able to blend that kind of, mindfulness in all your practices. So tell me a little bit more about that, because I know you have a regular meditation group, mm-hmm. right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Shortly after, I'd had this idea about mediation. Actually, I wrote a little piece a long time ago now on 9/11, that day of the bombings in New York City and so forth, the plane crashes in New York City. I thought, gosh, there could be a better way to resolve controversies. I kind of had this global view of that. So when I retired in 2003, I went right away and took a course at the Center for Dispute Resolution in Boulder, Colorado, which at that time had spawned some of the leading thinkers in the mediation realm, besides the Harvard negotiation practice right. and so forth. The CDR was a big one. And so I took that course and enjoyed it very much and thought this is what I would be doing. And a year or two later, I had always, my spiritual life has always been important to me, or not always, but in my adult life I decided this was something to pay attention to. And so anyway, there was a course offered at the Dispute Resolution Center at Pepperdine.
Oh, very nice. Let's go to Malibu and learn about
meditation in law and mediation practice. And it turns out there's this wonderful professor who started this program at the University of Missouri. He really wanted to teach his students mindfulness. And so that was really my first exposure actually to that. But it was sort of transformational, I suppose. And it's just a discipline and it's a process. And I've often thought that I wished that I'd known about that or taken that course while I was still a judge rather than taking it afterwards, But I've often thought I should do more with that in the sense that I really, and of course mindfulness has become, it's kind of the buzzword everywhere these days and in business and so forth, but truly for lawyers who tend to always be thinking about the answer to the question rather than what the person is actually saying with whom they are speaking, that kind of quick thinking of the next sort of deal. Mindfulness and listening and detachment and the kinds of things that are important they aren't important in meditation. Meditation is a way to train your mind to do that. I think those are tools that would be really valuable in the young lawyer's toolkit. When Linda McGuire at the University of Iowa and I have taught sessions along with the woman who teaches mindfulness training at the medical school, the first time we did that for the law school, for students at the law school, I went in and she had this huge big circle of chairs, and I thought, oh my gosh, we're only going to get like 4 people, so why do you have 30 chairs around? It was filled. The law students were dying to figure out some way to deal with the stress of law school. And they were interested in the books that I brought and stuff. So that was interesting. We did that a couple more times. But I've thought about doing it with the end of court. It's still viewed as kind of a foo-foo or la-la kind of a thing, to a certain extent. I've thought about having a pupillage group in the Inn of Court really devoted to mindful practices. And like the professor whose name is escaping me, who taught the course on mindfulness meditation in law and mediation practice, when he taught that at the University of Missouri, LLM program in mediation, he started every class with 20 minutes of...
Is it Riskin?
Yes, Leonard Riskin, yeah. And Judge Larry McClellan, of course, is a graduate of that program, and he said, and Larry told me not everybody was into that, but Leonard Riskin felt very strongly that we're going to take 20 minutes and we're going to meditate at the beginning of each class. It's surprising how you think you don't have time to do that every day, but the available time seems to expand if you'll be devoted to it. I would have to tell you that, and I meet with this little meditation group once a week, and since I had this accident that we talked about earlier, that kind of threw a lot of things off, and one of them was my regular routine of doing that, so I've been trying real hard to get back into it, but I'm not in the same place that I was even a year ago, and had been for maybe 10 years, of doing this. And I could use it. I mean, I need to get back at that, But anyway, I think that's something that I've thought about, maybe being bold and sharing that more with lawyers.
No, and we try to teach, when we teach new magistrate judges at the Federal Judicial Center, we do have a piece on the art of judging and stress management, and sometimes if you don't call it mindfulness, you can get people to think about how they think and to be more present and more intentional about what's going on in front of them, as opposed to queuing up the next 6 things that are coming right behind, which you have to be able to do that too. You have to be able to decide and let go.
All of those things.
But you also can pay attention.
Yeah.
And I think but that's something that you've really practiced, and I think it does show in how you deal with people.
Well, I appreciate that, and as I said, I've been feeling as though I've kind of let that discipline slide a little bit, and it would be helpful to me just in my life to get back at it. But to a certain extent, I think people are either kind of mindful by nature or always worried about the next thing, But I was thinking today about a particular mediation that I did a number of years ago that involved a family sort of matter. And in fact, what happened was the dad had left, when the oldest child was 2 or something, there's 2 kids left. They've never met their father. They're going to meet him for the first time at this mediation. The mother is real angry, as you can imagine. And I got them to focus on, let's forget the coulda, woulda, shouldas, and the worry about what this looks like for the future, and let's concentrate on today. And it was really the most rewarding sort of session. I did it like they would teach at CDR, not going back and forth with caucuses, but doing this conversation around the table with the mom who'd been abandoned 16 years ago, and the dad that suddenly saw the light and decided maybe he'd like to see his kids, and these 2 kids who were kind of intrigued about meeting their dad. The older boy thinking, what can I get out of this? But the girl just sort of intrigued about who this guy was. And at some point, but the focus was, I talked to them each a little bit ahead of time, the parents, let's talk about today and focus on today. and the promise that it holds. You know, and we'll see if we can't put something together. And it was just the sweetest time. They wanted to move slowly, and I recognized that that was going to be sort of an issue. So I proposed, well, how about starting with a dinner together, you know, the dad and the two kids. And so I say to the young girl, so Sarah, whatever her name is, what's your favorite kind of food? And without missing a beat, she says, Chinese, you know. And I could see the dad, who's not really exactly a winner anyway, but he's kind of, you know, grimacing. And I looked at him and say, and I bet you like Chinese food, don't you? Yeah, you know. But anyway, so we just sort of made some plans for them to start getting acquainted with one another. And I'll never forget, we walked out of the lawyer's office, and this dad had we talked about what do you like to do. I mean, all of them, you know, and kind of trying to get these people acquainted with each other. And he had a motorcycle in the back of his truck. And the kids, of course, were real intrigued by that, and I saw them go over with their dad. First time in 16 years, they'd never met this man before. And he kind of was talking about what he liked to do and about this motorcycle, and I thought, wow, that is the promise of mediation, you know. And most of them aren't like that, to be honest, you know. But I'm not often asked to do family law mediations, and I think it's because people think, well, other people do family law mediations or whatever. But you know, it was not like arguing with an insurance adjuster over the value of something. I don't have much patience with that, to be honest. And it was, anyway, that's where I do think those kinds of listening and being in the present moment sorts of skills, to be really, to do them intentionally, to be mindful of them, right, that they're even going to be of value here is really, it would be important. And really are important for all lawyers in their dealings with their clients.
And one of the things that also kind of intrigues me about something that you've done post-retirement is your board service. Because, I mean, I'm a big proponent of women on boards, but not boards that you don't get paid for. I mean, we do enough of that as you multitask and you align with interests that your kids have or your family or your church or whatever has. But this is like real board service, mm-hmm. like, wait a minute, this is a bank, you know, we can't get this wrong. Mm-hmm. So tell me, so that really kind of circles back to your early work, to your dad's work, yeah. to where you started in your practice. So again, for young lawyers to think that the opportunities you have as a young lawyer where you think, where is this going? It's not going anywhere. You know, fast forward 20 or 30 years, it connects back. So how did that all happen?
Well, let me tell you, it's interesting. I'm on the board of Quad City Bank and Trust. It's a bank that was formed out of the Davenport Bank. Some officers, when it went through the Northwest Bank change, and then Wells Fargo. And some of the folks from that bank decided they were going to start their own bank. So it was a de novo bank 23 years ago. Anyway, and it's been very successful in the Quad Cities. What's interesting, when I was asked to be on the board, the person who first kind of got that idea, I think, was the CEO of the bank, who I served on the board of trustees of St. Ambrose. He went to St. Ambrose, so John Anderson, lovely guy. But it's just part of a 3-bank holding company. On the chairman of the holding company, as well as the former president of Quad City Bank and Trust, who at that time was on the holding company, were men that I served on the allocations panel in United Way was before Emily was born, which had been pre-1977. And what I thought was interesting, those two guys, of all the guys on United Way, and United Way in the Quad Cities involves a lot of Deere executives and bank executives, lots of corporations. And I still remember getting congratulatory cards from Mike and Jim Brownson. And I hadn't really seen them much in the 30 years in between. But it seemed ironic that, as you say, there was this circle that came around, and here I was sitting on a publicly traded company board. I went from the bank board, now I'm on this publicly traded company board, which is the holding company for the banks. And it's been very interesting, very challenging. And I was, on the holding company, there was a a very well-respected lawyer whose family owned an industrial company in Rockford. One of our banks is in Rockford. And everybody really loved this guy, and he was a lawyer. And he was the chair of the Compensation Commission, which, as we all know, is a big issue in banks right now. And he died, and I happened to be appointed to the Compensation Commission, or Compensation Committee. I know, I never got paid for anything except for an hourly basis. I never got a bonus for anything I ever did. So this was new to me, performance-based incentive pay and that sort of thing. It so happened that this man that everybody liked so well died of cancer a couple years ago, and I was asked to step in and become chair of the Compensation Committee. And so that's been an important role for me, and I've learned a lot. And I guess I really love learning about it, And I had a little bit of this, a couple years at background in banking, and interestingly enough, at Bettendorf Bank and Trust, where I worked. Although I was in the trust department, here chaired the little trust department they had. As an officer of the bank, I was included in the loan committee meeting. So, I had sort of a feel for that to a certain extent. And, just 23 years as a judge gives you a lot of background in a lot of how things can go wrong. And so I think that's what I'm always attuned to at board meetings, is how this could go crosswise, or how this seems like a great idea today, but how would it look if it went south later on, And so that's sort of my role, to pay attention. It's not that they have wonderful lawyers, there's no doubt about that, but I think just that judgment born of experience of listening to lawsuits over the years of things that didn't go well is a benefit, and that's kind of what I bring to the board. It's just that sort of judgment about things. But there's been a lot for me to learn there too, and they are lovely, lovely people. So that's been fun for me. So both the bank board and then the holding company board. And interestingly, the executive committee for the holding company, 3 of the 4 members of the executive committee are women. The chairs of audit and risk and compensation all happen to be women in this company. And we recently made some very successful acquisitions, and there was a lot of meeting about that and working with investment bankers and so forth. And these other 2 women, much more skilled than I in the world of investment banking. So I learned a lot listening to that, but I thought, how interesting that this bank that when I went on the board, the stock was trading at 9 and today it's at 31. That's pretty cool. I've just learned a lot about the banking business. So, I'll do that for a couple more years, and that's great. I continue to sit on the board of the Community Foundation of the Great River Bend, and that's been an interesting time. But they asked me to stay on 1 more year, and I did. And so, but I'm about to wind that up.
And weren't you on an insurance company too?
Yeah, Royal Neighbors of America is headquartered in Rock Island, Illinois, and it's the largest, if not one of the largest, if not the largest financial organization in the United States of America that's run entirely by women. And it was started it's a fraternal benefit society that was started by the wives of the men who started Modern Woodmen of America. And this was like in 1895, I think. And of course the thought at that time was, why would a woman ever need life insurance? And it was the organization itself was very active in the suffrage movement in the 1920s. It's kind of it's either one of the small of the bigs, like the big fraternal benefit societies out there. It's really one of the bigger of the small ones. But I was asked to be on that board shortly after I retired from the court, and again that was a paid position, and these boards aren't like being on General Motors or Wells Fargo is making a lot of money, but it's been a nice way to help out the retirement and that sort of thing. On the Royal Neighbors of America board, though, the cool thing about that was there were women from around the country on that board. It had been a very closed, small board, and the Illinois Insurance Division, there was actually a lawsuit between, this is all public knowledge, there was a lawsuit between the management and the board. And it was a fraternal benefit society that had a lot of politics going on, and kind of unusual the way that people were elected to the board and whether they really had the background to be directors of a sizable financial organization. So anyway, there was this lawsuit, this before I was invited on the board, and the Illinois Insurance Division stepped in and said, we're going to dismantle the way it's currently being done here, and we are going to restate the articles, have you restate your articles of incorporation, organize yourselves pursuant to the SOX governance rules, and choose a new board. So they hired a recruiter out of Chicago that assembled these amazing women from around the country, and I happened to be sort of the local person when I got a call from them. I didn't know much about Royal Neighbors of America, but the board, as it was assembled when I got on there, there was a CEO of a woman CEO of a health organization in Washington, D.C., a nun who was the chair of the board of the Franciscan hospitals and so forth in Chicago, a woman, senior partner from Deloitte & Touche, national partner for Deloitte & Touche out of Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., dean of a business school in Florida, an amazing woman who ultimately, during the time I was on the board, she went on to be the CFO of Walmart International, and now is the executive vice president and CEO of Nestle Corporation in Geneva, Switzerland. So these are amazing women just to be hanging about with, you know, and learn about the insurance industry. And this particular organization is very focused on the needs of women. And so I did that for 8 years, and I chaired that governance committee, sat on the audit committee as well as the investment committee. And so that was another interesting thing. And then I taught at the University of Iowa Law School.
That's right. Both ethics and clinic, or well, you know, the
judicial externship program.
But making a pretty rigorous class to go along with that, which is important, I think.
Yeah, Dean Bill Hines had this idea about judicial externships that would be separate from the regular clinic program, but that he felt it really needed to be beefed up, and so asked me to come on board. And at first there were just a couple students, and by the time I retired, I did that for 10 years, I think. You know, we had 10 judges who had interns, and that made for a lot of work for me, actually, as it turned out.
Up and down the road.
That's right. There was both the traveling, and then because I knew all of the judges, both state and federal, they knew that I got it about confidentiality. I wasn't telling anybody about anything these students were working on, but I really helped them with their writing, and you know, and I'd see draft after draft of rulings on motions for summary judgment, you know. It was a little like crisis day, you know, the day before I'd meet my students and, oh my gosh, I got to read all these things. But it was wonderful getting to know the students and giving them a feel for the judiciary from someone who'd spent a lot of years in the judiciary.
Well, looping back to one of the questions from when you were interviewed for the Supreme Court, so do you think it matters that women are both on the bench, so just representationally, but in terms of process, in terms of how the court functions, or even if you look at the administrative piece of it? I still don't have a really clear answer on that for myself, but what's your answer on that?
I think it matters. My sense was in most adjudicative matters, we can read the opinions, or read the cases out there, the decisions. Not a lot of difference in my viewpoint, but I think on administration it mattered. And again, I don't like to stereotype men and women in the way they think or approach problems, but a very clear situation that came up early on when I was on the court involved the fact that I had been, well, the court always had these kind of blue ribbon commissions. They want to have good people on the rules of evidence, rules of civil procedure, that sort of thing. They want to have seasoned lawyers and judges on those committees making the rules. I had been recently, before I went on the Supreme Court, I'd recently been appointed, I think it was on the Rules of Evidence committee. And they were doing a lot of work at that time, trying to make the Iowa rules more consistent with the federal rules, as I recall. So there was a lot on their plate. And there was a little bit of a concern. Of course, I was the only woman on the committee, naturally. And so they kind of wanted to do this gender balancing, or at least have some gender in there. But all the other possible candidates that they looked at there didn't have that much experience. And it was like they only had 9 slots to fill. And as I listened to them, I thought to myself, now, if we expanded the pie a little bit, do you have to have 9? Could you bring someone on who meets your standards of lots of experience, but bring a newer woman judge on too, and you know, and kind of, and it was like, well, yeah, I guess we could do that. And what I realized that there's this real hierarchical thinking that the men kind of went through, to be honest, and I had more of a, well, how can we resolve this and kind of enlarge the pie, which later on I would learn is the thing to do in mediation. But it was that kind of thing. I just sort of saw the world a little differently often. And Celeste, one of the things that struck me early on was not only the fact that the gender differences, but the generational differences. I was really young when I went on the court compared to everybody. I was only 38.
Right.
And I still had kids at home that I was worrying about how to pay for daycare. I wasn't worried about that, but you know, I had those responsibilities.
And logistical issues that others
yes,
didn't.
But on the child support issue in particular, I mean, I had kids in daycare. I knew how much that cost. I knew that if mothers were only getting $25 a week for child support, they were barely able to pay for the daycare, let alone anything else. And so I think I brought that perspective to the court, which was helpful. Another member of the court had a relative, and it might have been a sister who'd been divorced or something, and sort of had the same. She realized she didn't get enough support from her spouse to make ends meet. And I think suddenly he had a voice of somebody else who could actually speak from experience about what it costs to have kids in childcare. That was so they really thought about that in the child support guidelines. I mean, I think I made some impact there. And there were just a few things like that from time to time that came up that were important. And certainly in there was a racial and gender bias task force early on that the court asked me to chair, and I think it's real important from a public perspective that isn't just a woman who's taken that responsibility on, and I was on it, but Lou Laverato chaired it. And in recent times, I've been kind of dismayed that there wasn't more done then about racial disparities in the prison population and what was really the root cause of that, because that was a long time ago that we were talking about it. And I think there were some changes made in I kind of crafted the language in our rules of professional conduct concerning harassment of women and disparaging treatment against women, or relationships with women who are your clients and that sort of thing, that only now have been, only rather recently, adopted by the ABA in the model rules. But we had some language about that pretty early on.
Well, and even changing gender in.
Oh yeah. Well, there was that project.
Yes, that's
there was that. There was that project, and of course that was what I did at way back when I was asked to be on the CLE commission, and only woman in the room, young, very young. And the first draft of the rules came out, and it was all, of course, male. You know, the lawyers, he shall do this, and he shall do that, and he shall do this, and he shall do that. And so I said, I raised my hand. I said, I noticed that this is all written in the just male language, you know, and Art McGivern just spoke up immediately. Said, of course, we'll put the boilerplate in there about references to he includes women, blah, blah, blah. And I kind of sighed and I raised my hand again. I said, I think with a little care, we could write this in gender neutral language. There was kind of this sigh around the table, you know, but they did. And I thought that was important at the time. And adopted it. Right. And it was that way, you know, that's the way the rules came out. And as far as I know, that's the first time there were ever any rules governing the lawyers in this state that actually were gender neutral in its language. Interestingly, if you fast forward about 15 years or something, one of the very first opinions I wrote on the Iowa Supreme Court, I happened to say something about, I was relying on a case from our sister state of South Dakota. And Art McGivern, who's by that time on the Supreme Court, calls and says, Linda, we like to use gender neutral language in our opinions. So I changed it to our neighboring state of South Dakota. You know. But, you know, it's small things. You know, Celeste, I think about how you, my friend Maggie Tinsman, to a certain extent Joy, kind of leaders of movements. I mean, they really rally women around them, whether it's to change, to be sure that the nominating commissioners, you did all that work on the state nominating commission, the Infinity Project that you've been so involved in on the federal courts, Maggie with breaking traffic and human trafficking stuff. I mean, she's got endless stuff that she's always organizing some group of people, and that's never really been my thing. And sometimes I feel kind of bad about that, I get these awards and I think, well, what have I done really other than maybe person by person, case by case, sort of done my thing and moved it along. I've just never been a big movement person, but I guess the world kind of takes all kinds or needs all kinds.
Well, but I think you model appropriate behavior. How's that?
One hopes to.
Well, but you could look at you in practice or on the bench or on the Supreme Court, and again think, well, that could happen. That's not an aberration. It's not because her father-in-law was Henry Neuman Sr. It's because she did the work and she showed up, and so people could count on you. And so the more women who can get a door open and then hold it open, which is what you're doing on 50/50 in 2020. And guess who that's with? Joy and Maggie. I mean, we do think, when is there going to be another generation to step up? So some ways we're having the same conversation we've had for 30 years, but the willingness to not say, well, I think I'm just going to go to Colorado for 2 months and you let me know how that comes out. So that work has been going on for, when did that start? 09, 50/50 in 2020.
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure about the date. It's been a little while.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, I've thought a lot about this, and one of the kind of final questions, these guys are going to be tired of listening to all this, but, what do you hope to be remembered for? But one of the things I've thought about is that, I followed Margaret Briles in the judiciary in the 7th Judicial District. And you and I both, really, we love Margaret. I mean, she was a wonderful, wonderful person. But as you well know, she was often the smartest person in the room, and she didn't suffer fools very well. Right. So she had a style that once she was appointed on the bench, it wasn't exact. If people thought, oh my gosh, women judges are all going to be like her, it was going to kind of close the door instead of open it. I just had kind of a different personality than Margaret, and not as smart as she was, so I didn't have to be the smartest person in the room. But in a way, you kind of learn from Margaret kind of what works and what doesn't work. And she mellowed greatly over the years, and really had people became very, very fond of her. But lawyers were kind of afraid of her early on, especially, we all were to a certain extent, but lawyers were, and particularly lawyers, well, she liked really good lawyers, but she didn't have any patience for lawyers who weren't. But I can remember one day, our chambers were adjoining at the Scott County Courthouse, and lawyers were in my chambers on a motion hearing, and the door was open, I guess, and we could hear Judge Briles, Margaret, yelling at some lawyer. And we were done with our hearing, but these grown men lawyers in my room said, Judge, do you mind, can we stay in your office? So, they didn't want to be in the line of fire out there. And so I hope that in my role as a trial judge or an appellate judge, appear to be someone who, as you suggest, kind of an ordinary person doing their job, accessible, fair, kind, not somebody to be afraid of, and in that way, open the pathway for more women to seek those important jobs, those important roles. And I don't say that I'm responsible for it. There are lots of reasons why that door opened, but there are a lot more women judges now than there were in 1982.
But not on the Supreme Court.
No, you're right. You are right.
But we'll keep working. We'll just give it another 30 years.
Well, that whole thing was just kind of a mess. Just
Well, I know,
generally.
but you just have to keep showing up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it really is getting a seat at the table, continuing to try to make the process work.
Yeah, yeah.
Not getting run over by a deer.
Well, that too.
And
Yeah, and
not
staying
going
healthy.
to Colorado, so just sticking with us.
Yeah, staying healthy, you know.
All right, so anything else you want to tell us, or you want to make sure that your friends and family, I look at you, made notes, you
Well,
thought this through?
there was a question about why I retired, and maybe that
Okay.
ought to, because it
Why
kind
did
of goes
you
to the
retire?
point that you're making, this last point, and that was, I mean, I could have stayed on the court, I think, till I was 72, but I went on the bench on the Supreme Court when I was 38, and I really thought, you know, so long as I hang on to this position, I'm preventing somebody else from making their contribution to the development of law in this state. It is a really pretty wonderful job, and it's an important job. And I really thought, okay, and if I stayed on longer, I'd probably have to be the chief, and then I'd have to stay on for another 10 years, and then I would have not hardly done anything in my professional career except be a judge. And so I just decided, Iowa had this rule that if you had 20 years in the judiciary and you were 55, you could take retirement, and I just decided to do it. And then that opened up an opportunity for somebody else to be on the court. So it was really, that sounds kind of altruistic, but it was really,
I believe
really
that.
true.
I believe you have your turn, and then it's somebody else's turn.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like I'm in favor of term limits, and in a way I am. You know, I kind of followed, Mark McCormick was on the court for 10 years, I think, and simply decided I've made my contribution, and I felt really that same way too. You know, after 17 years, I probably made as much of a contribution as I reasonably could, you know, and I was ready to do something else. And I was very grateful to have the opportunity to work for a while back at the law firm, and then mostly teach and do some mediation and arbitration and things. So it's been great.
Well, and you have kids and grandkids, and they're everywhere.
There's that too. That's
and
right.
So that gives you a chance to go and do that kind of stuff.
Exactly. There's a lot out there. Life is good. Thank you for
Good. Well,
this
thank
interview
you.
today.
Thank you for finally showing up. Not having broken bones while you do.
And
Okay.
thank you to these guys, Mark Harding and Richard Leifert, who keep up this history, faithfully keep up this history.
Yes.
It was my pleasure to have an opportunity to interview a couple other people, and this was fun being the target here today.